Alaska is twice the size of Texas, and seemingly half of it wants to kill you. But there is a specific zone, the Alaska Triangle, where reality itself seems to break down. Thousands have entered this wilderness and simply ceased to exist. Today, we are covering the 10 most shocking, unexplained disappearances in this frozen graveyard. These stories defy explanation. So please subscribe to the channel, stay close to the trail, and let's begin. There's a place in Alaska where an entire town just left. Not slowly. Not over years as jobs dried up or resources ran out. They packed their bags in the middle of the 1940s and walked away from a profitable salmon cannery, leaving homes fully furnished, doors unlocked, and money still in the registers, and they never came back. The place is called Portlock, or Port Chatham, depending on which map you're looking at. It sits on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, wedged between the Chugach Mountains and the freezing waters of the Gulf of Alaska. Today, it's a graveyard of rusted machinery and moss-covered buildings, slowly being swallowed by the forest. The silence there is thick, not peaceful, but watchful, like something is still there, waiting. But here's what makes this different from every other Alaskan ghost town. The people who lived there didn't leave because of economics or weather or bad luck. They left because something was killing them. And whatever it wasn't a bear. Let me take you back to the 1940s. Portlock wasn't some spooky ruin back then. It was a working-class boomtown. The salmon cannery was churning out money. Loggers were cutting timber from the dense Sitka spruce forests. Russian Aleut families and indigenous Sugpiaq people had built a tight-knit community here. Tough people who knew how to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. These weren't city folks playing wilderness games. They lived with grizzly bears in their backyards. They fished in waters cold enough to kill you in minutes. They weren't easily spooked. The geography matters here. Portlock is isolated in a way that's hard to imagine if you've never been to rural Alaska. The mountains rise vertically behind the town, creating this claustrophobic wall of rock and forest. The ocean is in front. There's no road in or out, never was. The only way to reach the outside world was by boat or floatplane, and in the 1940s, that meant help was always days away. The fog rolls off the Gulf in thick banks that can hide a man standing 10 feet from you. The forest is so dense you could be 5 yards off a trail and completely invisible. And in that forest, the locals said, lived the Nantiinnik, the big man, the stealer of people, half man, half beast. Now, Alaska is full of monster stories. Every culture up there has some version of a wild man legend. But what's different about the Nantiinnik is that the people of Portlock didn't treat it like folklore. They treated it like a serial killer living in their neighborhood. Because by the 1940s, it had stopped being a campfire story and started being a body count. The first signs were easy to dismiss. Hunters would head into the mountains to track Dall sheep or moose and not come back. At first, people assumed they'd gotten lost or injured. But then their gear started turning up. Rifles found bent in half or smashed against trees, destroyed with a force that didn't make sense. A rifle is solid steel. You don't accidentally break one. And if a bear gets you, they don't dismantle your weapon. They eat you and move on. Then came the tracks. Not bear tracks. Everyone knew what those looked like. These were humanoid. 18 inches long, 5 toes, no claws. Deep impressions in the mud, spaced out like something massive and bipedal was walking upright through the forest. Hunters who saw them didn't stick around to investigate. They came back to town, white-faced, and refused to go back into those woods alone. The logging crews started reporting activity. Trees being ripped out of the ground, not cut down, but torn up by the roots and left lying across trails. Heavy mining equipment moved overnight, repositioned in ways that would require a crew of men with machinery. Except, no crew was there. The workers would arrive in the morning to find a bulldozer blade bent or a winch cable snapped, not cut, and no explanation. And then there were the screams. At night, echoing down from the mountains, not wolves, not bears, something that sounded almost human but not quite. Low, guttural roars that rattled windows and made dogs whimper and hide. But the turning point, the moment this went from unsettling to we need to leave, was the death of Andrew Kamluck. Kamluck was a logger, strong guy, experienced in the woods. In 1931, he went out to work a site and didn't come back. When they found him, he was dead near a piece of heavy logging machinery. But here's the thing. He'd been struck in the head with that machinery. A massive piece of cast iron used for moving logs, something so heavy it would take 2 men just to lift. And it wasn't just a blow. The force had been catastrophic. The kind of trauma you see in industrial accidents, except there was no accident here, no machinery malfunction, just a man and a weapon too heavy for another man to swing. And his body was found 10 feet from the impact site, like he'd been hit so hard he'd been launched. Then, in the 1940s, the disappearances escalated. A group of cannery workers went up into the mountains to hunt. They never came back. Days later, their bodies, or what was left of them, washed up in the lagoon. The reports from the time are vague, but the locals who saw them weren't vague at all. They described dismemberment. Arms torn from sockets, bodies that looked like they'd been pulled apart, not cut. This wasn't predation. This wasn't a bear defending its territory. This was something else. And that's when the mass exodus began. Think about what it takes to make an entire town abandon their homes. Not slowly, over months as businesses close and people trickle away. No, Portlock's residents packed up in a matter of weeks and left everything. Furniture still in the houses, dishes on the tables. The post office closed in 1950, and that was it. The last families loaded onto boats and never looked back. They went to Nanwalek, to Seldovia, to anywhere else, anywhere that wasn't Portlock. And they never came back. Now, here's where the rational explanations start showing up, and we need to tear them apart because they don't hold up. Theory 1. Economic decline. The official story, the one you'll find if you dig through Alaska historical records, is that Portlock died because the cannery closed and the Alaska Route 1 highway made the port obsolete. Towns fail all the time for economic reasons. Nothing weird about that, right? Except, think about it. You don't abandon a house with all your belongings inside because the job market dried up. You sell the house, you take your stuff, you move, you don't flee. And Portlock wasn't a slow decline. It was a panic evacuation. These were people who had built lives there. They had furniture, tools, family heirlooms, and they left it all. When a town dies economically, it happens over years. People trickle away. Buildings are stripped for salvage. Portlock wasn't stripped. It was left. Like the residents ran out the door and never stopped running. Theory 2, just a bear. Okay, so maybe it was a rogue grizzly. Bears are terrifying. A big coastal brown bear can weigh 500 pounds and take your head off with one swipe. But here's the problem. Bears don't stalk communities for years. They don't systematically destroy equipment, and they don't leave humanoid tracks. And most importantly, they don't create pattern-based terror. A bear kills when it's hungry or threatened. It doesn't engage in psychological warfare, screaming from the tree line, watching from the fog, smashing machinery but leaving food stores untouched. That's not animal behavior. That's territorial behavior. Intelligent, methodical, and sustained. And let's talk about the Kamluck scene again. A bear attack leaves claw marks, bite wounds, and usually signs of feeding. The forensic evidence from Kamluck's death was blunt force trauma from a heavy object wielded with purpose. That's not a bear. That's a predator with hands. Theory 3. Mass hysteria. Some skeptics suggest the whole thing was mass hysteria. A few unexplained deaths, some scared workers, and suddenly everyone seeing monsters in the fog. It snowballed, and people convinced themselves there was a Bigfoot. But here's what that theory can't explain. The physical evidence. The bent rifles, the uprooted trees, the bodies with specific non-animal trauma. Mass hysteria doesn't bend steel. It doesn't create 18-inch humanoid footprints. And it sure as hell doesn't make an entire population of experienced outdoorsmen, people who lived alongside bears and wolves their whole lives, suddenly decide they're too terrified to stay. And here's the kicker. Even today, locals won't go there. 75 years later, If it was just hysteria in the 1940s, you'd think by now someone would have moved back, built a fishing lodge, turned it into a tourist trap. But no one does. The place sits empty. And when you talk to people in Nanwalek or Seldovia, the towns where Portlock's refugees fled, they'll tell you flat out, "We don't go there. Something's wrong with that place." So what happened at Portlock? Maybe it was a rogue bear with unusual behavior. Maybe it was a series of accidents and coincidences that fed into local legends and created a feedback loop of fear. Maybe the economic collapse just happened to coincide with a string of bad luck, and the residents, already superstitious, connected dots that weren't there. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something in those woods, something big, intelligent, and territorial. Something that viewed the loggers and fishermen as invaders in its space. And when they didn't leave on their own, it made them leave. Today, Portlock is a rotting skeleton. The cannery gears are orange with rust. The post office is a collapsed pile of wood. The forest has reclaimed the streets. If you go there, and I'm not recommending you do, you'll find the silence overwhelming. Not the peaceful quiet of an abandoned place, but the heavy, oppressive silence of somewhere that's watching you. Because whatever drove those people out in the 1940s, it never left. October 16th, 1972. Anchorage, Alaska. A small Cessna 310 takes off carrying 4 men. On board, the House Majority Leader of the United States, one of the most powerful politicians in the country. Also on board, a sitting congressman, his aide, and an experienced bush pilot. They're flying to Juneau for a campaign fundraiser. It's a routine flight. Politicians make this trip all the time. The plane enters a mountain pass. And then, nothing. No distress call, no mayday, no emergency beacon, just silence. And here's the thing that should keep you up at night. They never found it. Not the plane, not the bodies, not a single piece of wreckage. The United States military launched the largest search and rescue operation in American history at that point. They threw everything at it. Coast Guard cutters, Air Force cargo planes, civilian volunteers, even SR-71 Blackbird spy planes taking high-altitude photographs of the terrain, 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, 39 days of non-stop searching, covering 325,000 square miles of Alaskan wilderness. And they found absolutely nothing. 2 of the most important men in America flew into a cloud and simply ceased to exist. Let me set the scene for you, because the context here matters. It's October 1972. Richard Nixon is president. The Vietnam War is still raging. Watergate is just starting to bubble under the surface. And it's an election year, which means politicians are crisscrossing the country trying to secure votes. Hale Boggs is the House Majority Leader. Think Nancy Pelosi or Kevin McCarthy level of power. This guy isn't some backbencher. He's the second most powerful person in the House of Representatives. He's been in Congress since 1941. He helped pass the Civil Rights Act. He was on the Warren Commission that investigated JFK's assassination. And here's a detail that's going to matter later. In the months before this flight, Boggs had been publicly attacking J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, accusing them of wiretapping members of Congress and abusing their power. He wasn't making friends in Washington. Nick Begich is Alaska's sole representative. He's 40 years old, charismatic, popular, and running for re-election against a guy named Don Young. This trip to Juneau is about raising money and shaking hands, standard campaign stuff. He's traveling with his aide, Russell Brown, a 37-year-old staffer just doing his job. And then there's the pilot, Don Johns. You need to understand something about Don Johns. This wasn't some weekend hobbyist flying a Cessna for fun. Johns owned Pan Alaska Airways. He had thousands of hours in the cockpit. He knew the terrain. He'd flown this route, Anchorage to Juneau, dozens of times. Other pilots described him as a crackerjack aviator, one of the best bush pilots in Alaska. He was confident, maybe even cocky. In fact, the month he disappeared, he'd published an article in an aviation magazine titled Ice Without Fear, arguing that pilots were too cautious about flying in icing conditions. His whole philosophy was, if you know what you're doing, you can handle it. So when these four men board that Cessna 310C, tail number N1820H, on the morning of October 16th, there's no sense of doom. It's a gray, overcast day, but that's Alaska in October. It's not unusual. The weather briefing warns of turbulence and possible icing in the mountain passes, but nothing that would ground an experienced pilot. Johns files his flight plan. The plane takes off at 8:59 a.m. from runway 24R at Anchorage International. The flight to Juneau should take about 3.5 hours. They never arrive. Let's walk through what we know happened minute by minute, because the details here are critical. 9 a.m. Air traffic control spots the Cessna on radar about 2 miles out from the airport. The plane is climbing, banking southeast toward the Turnagain Arm. Altitude, 2,000 feet, everything looks normal. 9:09 a.m. Don Johns makes his final radio contact. He's calling Anchorage Flight Service to officially file his flight plan. Oddly, he's doing this after takeoff, which is unusual but not illegal. He reports 4 souls on board. He states he has survival gear, though this will later be disputed. The Flight Service gives him an updated weather report, turbulence expected, icing possible. Johns acknowledges. His voice is calm, routine. And that's it. That's the last anyone ever hears from them. The Cessna is supposed to fly through Portage Pass, a narrow corridor between mountains that connects Anchorage to Prince William Sound. It's the most direct route, but it's notorious for bad weather. Fog rolls in fast. The peaks on either side rise to thousands of feet, and if you're flying VFR, visual flight rules, meaning you're navigating by sight, not instruments, and the clouds drop too low, you're in trouble. At some point after 9:09 a.m., the plane enters that pass, and it just vanishes. 1:15 p.m. The plane is officially overdue. It should have landed in Juneau hours ago. Alarm bells start ringing, and then the search begins. Now, this is where you have to understand the scale of what happened next. This wasn't a local volunteer effort. This was the full force of the United States government mobilized to find 2 of its own. The Coast Guard deploys cutters into Prince William Sound. The Air Force sends C-130 Hercules cargo planes equipped with search radar. The Civil Air Patrol, civilian pilots, volunteers dozens of small aircraft to sweep the mountains. And here's the part that sounds like fiction. The military even uses SR-71 Blackbirds, the fastest spy planes on Earth, to fly high-altitude reconnaissance missions and photograph the terrain with cameras so powerful they could spot a license plate from 80,000 feet. 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, hundreds of personnel. They search for 39 days straight, covering 325,000 square miles, an area larger than Texas. They fly over every mountain, every glacier, every fjord between Anchorage and Juneau. They scan Prince William Sound. They check remote lakes where the plane might have made an emergency landing. They find nothing. Not a piece of fuselage, not a seat cushion, not an oil slick, not a single rivet. It's as if the Cessna 310 and everyone on board were erased from existence. November 24, 1972. After 39 days, the search is officially called off. Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns are declared missing and presumed dead. Okay, so the official explanation is pretty straightforward. Bad weather, pilot error, maybe icing on the wings. The plane hit a mountain or crashed into the ocean, and the wreckage sank or was buried in snow. Case closed, right? Except that explanation has some serious problems. Let's pick it apart. Problem 1, the emergency locator transmitter. By law, every aircraft in Alaska in 1972 was required to carry an ELT, an emergency locator transmitter. This device is brilliant in its simplicity. When a plane crashes, the G-forces from the impact automatically trigger the ELT, and it starts broadcasting a distress signal on an emergency frequency that can be picked up by satellites and search planes. It's designed to survive crashes, fires, even submersion in water for a limited time. The whole point is that even if everyone on board is killed instantly, the plane itself screams for help. So here's the question. Where was the signal? During the entire 39-day search, not a single confirmed ELT signal was detected. There were a couple of false alarms, weak signals that led searchers on wild goose chases, but nothing that panned out. Investigators later discovered that Don Johns' portable ELT was found in a different plane, sitting in a hangar in Fairbanks. Some witnesses claimed to have seen something that looked like an ELT in Johns' briefcase before the flight, but no one could confirm it was actually on board the Cessna, so either the ELT failed, which is statistically unlikely, or it wasn't on the plane at all. And if it wasn't on the plane, that's a violation of federal law. But here's where it gets weird. If the plane crashed into the ocean or into a glacier at high speed, the ELT might not have survived to transmit. But for that to happen, the crash would have had to be catastrophic, a high-speed nosedive straight into the ground or water. And if that's the case, where's the debris? Problem 2, the physics of wreckage. A Cessna 310 weighs about 3,000 pounds empty. It's made of aluminum, steel, glass, rubber, fabric, materials that don't just disappear. Even if a plane disintegrates on impact, it leaves a debris field. We're talking hundreds of pieces scattered across the landscape, chunks of fuselage, the engine block, pieces of the wings, seats, luggage, fuel tanks. And in a mountainous area like Portage Pass, if the plane hit a peak, there would be a scar, a visible impact site with scorch marks from the fuel igniting. The searchers in 1972 were looking for exactly that. They had experienced mountain rescue teams, pilots who knew the terrain, and some of the best aerial surveillance technology in the world, and they found nothing. Not a glint of metal, not a discoloration in the snow, not a burned tree. Now, some people argue the plane could have crashed into deep water, Prince William Sound, for example. The water there is cold, deep, and murky. A plane could sink and disappear. But here's the thing. Even in a water crash, debris floats. Seat cushions, luggage, fuel slicks, pieces of the cabin. The Coast Guard was scouring the coastline in the Sound for weeks. They didn't find a single floating piece of wreckage. Or maybe the plane hit a glacier and the snow immediately buried it. Okay, that's plausible. But glaciers move. They're slow rivers of ice grinding toward the sea. Over the last 50-plus years, if the plane was entombed in a glacier, pieces of it should have started emerging at the glacier's edge, the toe. We've seen this happen with other lost aircraft. In 2012, a Marine Corps plane that crashed in a California glacier in 1942 finally started spitting out wreckage 70 years later. But from N-1812H, nothing ever. Problem 3, the conspiracy. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Because this isn't just any plane crash, this is the House Majority Leader vanishing into thin air during one of the most paranoid periods in American history. Hale Boggs sat on the Warren Commission. That's the group that investigated JFK's assassination and concluded Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But by 1972, Boggs was having serious doubts. He publicly questioned the commission's findings. He also went to war with J. Edgar Hoover, accusing the FBI of illegal wiretapping and surveillance. In April 1972, just 6 months before he disappeared, Boggs gave a speech on the House floor calling for Hoover's resignation. He wasn't subtle about it. He was making powerful enemies. And then his plane vanishes. In 1994, 22 years after the crash, a man named Jerry Max Pasley comes forward. Pasley is a convicted bomber with ties to organized crime. He tells investigators that in 1972, he was hired to transport a briefcase from Arizona to Anchorage. He claims he later learned that briefcase contained a bomb, and that bomb was placed on N-1812H. He says the hit was ordered because of Boggs's connections to anti-organized crime legislation or his attacks on the FBI. The FBI initially considered Pasley credible enough to investigate, but they eventually shut down the inquiry, and no physical evidence of a bomb was ever found. Without wreckage, there's no way to test for explosive residue. So the bomb theory remains exactly that, a theory. But it's a theory with a motive, and in the world of high-stakes politics, motive matters. So what happened to Hale Boggs and Nick Begich? The most likely explanation is still pilot error combined with bad weather. Don Johns, confident in his skills, pushed into conditions he shouldn't have. The plane iced up, stalled, and crashed into a glacier or the ocean in a location so remote or so deep that 50 years of searching, by professionals and amateurs alike, hasn't turned up a trace. But that explanation requires you to accept that a plane can just vanish. That with all our technology, all our resources, all our determination, we can lose a Cessna 310 carrying some of the most important men in the country and never find a single bolt. And maybe that's true. Alaska is vast. The wilderness swallows things. But it's hard to shake the feeling that there's more to this story. One thing we know for certain: this crash changed aviation law. Because of the Boggs-Begich disappearance, Congress passed legislation requiring more robust ELTs in all U.S. aircraft. So in a grim way, their deaths made flying safer for everyone who came after. But their families never got closure. No bodies were ever recovered, no funeral, just an empty sky and 50 years of questions. Hale Boggs and Nick Begich flew into the clouds on October 16, 1972, and they never came out. July 4, 2012, Seward, Alaska. It's Independence Day, and the town is packed. Thousands of people have gathered for one of the most brutal foot races in America, the Mount Marathon Race. It's not a marathon in distance, it's only about 3 miles. But those 3 miles go straight up a mountain and straight back down. Runners climb 322 vertical feet in less than a mile, scrambling over shale, mud, and snow before plummeting back to the finish line. People break bones, they get hypothermia, they bleed. It's called the toughest 5K on the planet, and it's not marketing hype. On this particular July 4th, a 66-year-old man named Michael LeMaitre is running the race for the first time. He's not fast, he's not an elite athlete, but he's determined. This is a bucket list moment for him. He wants to prove to himself he can do it. Michael LeMaitre starts the race surrounded by hundreds of runners and thousands of spectators lining the streets and the mountain trails, watching through binoculars and cameras. The route is well marked. There are checkpoints. There are race officials stationed at the turnaround point at the top. This is not some solo expedition into uncharted wilderness. This is a monitored, organized public event, and somehow, impossibly, Michael LeMaitre vanishes. Not at the top, not in some remote corner of the mountain. He disappears 200 feet below the summit on a marked trail while race officials are watching him. He's there one moment, and then he's just gone. They search for weeks. Helicopters with thermal imaging, search dogs, mountain rescue teams, volunteers combing every inch of the route. They find nothing. No body, no clothing. No trace. Michael LeMaitre is the only person in the 90-year history of the Mount Marathon Race to vanish without a trace. And the question that haunts everyone who's looked into this case is simple. How do you disappear in front of a crowd? Let me paint the picture for you, because the setting is everything here. Seward, Alaska is a small coastal town, population around 2,000, tucked between the mountains in Resurrection Bay. Every July 4th, the town's population explodes. Tourists flood in, RVs line the streets. Everyone's there for the same reason, the Mount Marathon Race. It's been a tradition since 1915, and it's become this legendary test of endurance and pain tolerance. If you finish, you're a hero. If you don't, well, at least you tried. The race itself is insane. You start at sea level in downtown Seward, run through the streets, and then hit the mountain. The first section is brutal, a near vertical climb up a dirt and shale trail that locals call the ladder. Your lungs are screaming, your legs are burning, you're grabbing onto rocks and roots just to pull yourself up. And if it's been raining, which it often is in Alaska, the trail turns into a slick, muddy nightmare. Once you reach the summit, or close to it, the turnaround point is a big rock near the top. You turn around and come back down, and the descent is, if anything, more dangerous than the climb. Runners don't jog down, they fall down. They're sliding on their butts, skidding on their heels, catching themselves on bushes. Broken ankles are common, so are dislocated shoulders. The finish line looks like a Civil War field hospital. But here's the key thing. This race is watched. Thousands of spectators line the route. Locals set up lawn chairs on the lower slopes and use binoculars to track the runners. There are photographers, there are race officials stationed at key points, including the turnaround rock at the top. And in 2012, the weather was overcast and drizzly, but visibility wasn't terrible. It wasn't a complete whiteout. You could see. Enter Michael Lemaitre. Michael is 66 years old. He's a successful businessman from Anchorage. He's fit for his age. He's completed the Itatoski, a long-distance cross-country ski race, but he's not a mountain runner. This is his first time attempting Mount Marathon. He won his spot in the race through a lottery system, which is how most non-elite runners get in. He's excited, nervous. His wife, Peggy, and their family are there to cheer him on. But there's a problem Michael doesn't fully disclose to race organizers. He has vision issues. Later, during the wrongful death lawsuit his family filed, it came out that Michael had significant trouble with his eyesight, possibly macular degeneration or something similar. He struggled to recognize faces up close. On a foggy mountain where the trail markers are sometimes just painted rocks or cairns, where the path can be indistinguishable from a cliff edge, this is a critical handicap. Michael also makes a tactical error. He doesn't do a practice climb. Most first-timers scout the route beforehand to familiarize themselves with the terrain. Michael doesn't. So when he lines up at the starting line on July 4th, he's going into this race almost blind, both literally and figuratively. The gun goes off in the early afternoon. The elite runners rocket up the mountain. Michael is at the back of the pack, but he's moving, slow and steady. He's wearing black clothing, black shirt, black shorts, black gloves, which will turn out to be a problem later, because black gear offers zero contrast against the dark, wet rock of the mountain. He's essentially camouflaged. About halfway up, someone snaps a photo of him. He's plodding along, determined. His race bib, number 5 and 48, is clearly visible. Critically, the photo shows he's carrying no water. This is important. By the time he reaches the top, he's been climbing for over 3 hours in cold, damp conditions. Dehydration affects your brain. It impairs judgment. It makes you confused. Now, here's where the timeline gets critical. It's around 6 p.m. Most of the runners have finished. The elite athletes have been done for hours, but there are always stragglers, people who are just trying to survive the course. Michael is the last runner still on the mountain. Race officials at the turnaround rock, the checkpoint at the top, have been waiting for him. They're cold, they're wet, they're ready to pack up and go home. And then they see him. Michael is approximately 200 feet below the turnaround rock, climbing toward them. One of the officials radios down to the base, one more runner coming up. They can see him. He's moving slowly, but he's there. They wait for him to crest the ridge, and they wait. And they wait. Michael Lemaitre never arrives. One of the officials, concerned, hikes down to check on him. He encounters Michael about 200 feet below the summit. They have a brief exchange. Official: "How are you doing?" Michael: "He indicates he's okay. He wants to finish." The official, satisfied, continues his descent. Michael, presumably, continues his climb. That's the last time anyone ever sees Michael Lemaitre. He doesn't reach the turnaround rock. He doesn't descend. He just stops existing. By evening, his family is panicking. The race is over. Every other runner has crossed the finish line or been accounted for. Michael is gone. Search and rescue is mobilized immediately. Helicopters take off. Volunteers flood the mountain. They search all night. Nothing. The search continues for days, then weeks. They bring in the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group, experts who know this terrain intimately. They deploy search dogs trained to find human scent. They use helicopters equipped with FLIR, forward-looking infrared, thermal imaging cameras that can detect body heat through fog and foliage. A human body at 98.6 degrees should light up like a beacon on those sensors, especially on a cold Alaskan mountain. They find nothing. No body, no clothing, no footprints leading off the trail. It's as if Michael took one more step and fell through a trapdoor in reality. Okay, so the obvious explanation is he fell. Mount Marathon is steep. People get hurt. Maybe he slipped off the trail, tumbled down a cliff, and his body ended up in some hidden crevasse or under a snowbank. Tragic, but explainable. Except That doesn't actually work. Let me explain why. Problem 1. The physics of falling Mount Marathon is steep, yes, but it's not a sheer vertical drop. It's a slope, a very steep slope, covered in shale, dirt, and vegetation. If you fall, you don't disappear into a void. You tumble, you roll, you slide, and you end up somewhere lower. Gravity is consistent. You fall down. The search teams didn't just look at the summit. They combed the entire mountain, top to bottom, focusing especially on the areas below where Michael was last seen. They checked every gully, every ravine, every boulder field. They looked for disturbed vegetation, places where a 180-pound man might have crashed through bushes. They looked for clothing snagged on branches. They looked for blood on rocks. They found nothing. Now, some people argue he could have fallen into a snow bridge, a hollow cavity under the snow where a stream has melted out the ice. These are essentially traps. You step on what looks like solid ground, and you fall through into a hidden void. The snow collapses over you, and you're buried. Okay, that's theoretically possible. The 2012 season had record snowfall, and the mountain was covered in more snow than usual. But here's the problem. Search teams specifically looked for collapsed snow bridges. They probed suspicious areas with poles. They brought in avalanche dogs trained to detect scent under snow. And remember, they had thermal imaging. Even under several feet of snow, a body gives off heat for hours, sometimes days, depending on conditions. The FLIR cameras should have detected him. They didn't. Problem 2. The witnesses. Let's talk about how visible this section of the mountain is. Michael disappeared 200 feet from the summit. That's about 2/3 the length of a football field. Race officials were literally looking down at him. Spectators with binoculars were scattered on the lower slopes, looking up. The trail is exposed. There's not a lot of dense forest at that elevation. It's mostly rock and low brush. So how do you vanish in that tiny window of space and time? The official who spoke to Michael said the interaction lasted maybe a minute or two. Then the official continued down, and Michael, presumably, continued up. For Michael to disappear, he would have had to leave the trail immediately after that conversation, not 10 minutes later. Not after he rested. Immediately. And he would have had to do it without anyone seeing him. But here's the thing. If you're 66 years old, exhausted, dehydrated, and disoriented, you're not moving quickly. You're not sprinting off into the wilderness. You're shuffling. You're stumbling, and if you collapse or fall, you make noise, you cry out, you crash through brush, no one heard anything. Problem 3. The legal aftermath. After the search was called off, Michael's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the race organizers, the Seward Chamber of Commerce. They argued that the race was negligent, that officials should have swept the course behind the last runner, that the safety protocols were inadequate. During the legal proceedings, something disturbing came to light. The race organizers, trying to defend themselves, dug into Michael's background. They investigated his finances, his personal life, looking for any reason he might have wanted to disappear. The implication was ugly. Maybe Michael staged his own death. Maybe he had debts or problems or reasons to vanish. The investigation found nothing. No hidden bank accounts, no secret life, no motive. And in 2014, the family settled the lawsuit for $20,000, a surprisingly small amount, which suggests they weren't after money. They just wanted acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Michael LeMaitre was declared legally dead, but his body has never been found. So what happened to Michael LeMaitre? The most rational explanation is still that he fell, probably disoriented by exhaustion, dehydration, and his vision problems. And his body ended up in a location so remote or so well hidden that 5 decades of searching by professionals and amateurs hasn't turned it up. Maybe he's under a collapsed snow bridge that never melted. Maybe he slipped into a crevasse that's too narrow for searchers to spot. Maybe he tumbled down the backside of the mountain into dense brush, and his body was scavenged by animals, scattering the remains. All of those are possible, but they require you to accept a staggering amount of bad luck and coincidence. They require you to believe that a man can vanish 200 feet from a checkpoint on a trail during a public event without leaving a single trace. No scent trail for the dogs, no heat signature for the thermal cameras, no disturbed vegetation, no piece of clothing. And that's the part that keeps me up at night, because Mount Marathon isn't Everest, it's not the Amazon rainforest, it's a small mountain in Alaska that thousands of people run up and down every single year. It's been climbed and photographed and mapped more thoroughly than most mountains in the world. And yet Michael LeMaitre found a way to disappear there as completely as if he'd walked into another dimension. In the 90-plus-year history of the Mount Marathon race, he's the only person to vanish without a trace. Plenty of people have been injured. Some have died, heart attacks mostly. But their bodies were found. Always. Until Michael. His family never got closure. No funeral, no grave, just an empty space where a husband and father used to be. Michael LeMaitre started a race with hundreds of people watching, and somewhere on that mountain, he finished it alone, in a place no one can find. January 26, 1950, Elmendorf Air Force Base, Alaska. It's the height of the Cold War. The Arctic is a strategic battleground, and Alaska is the front line. American and Canadian forces are gearing up for Operation Sweetbriar, a massive joint military exercise designed to test northern defenses against a potential Soviet invasion. The skies are full of military traffic. The radio frequencies are jammed with chatter. It's organized chaos. Into this chaos, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, tail number 4272469, prepares for takeoff. It's a routine transport flight. Destination, Great Falls, Montana. On board, 44 people, 8 crew members, 36 passengers. Most of them are military personnel heading home or to their next assignment. But not all of them. There's a pregnant woman named Joyce Esp, traveling with her toddler son, Victor. There's a young sergeant who'd just written a letter home joking, "I guess you thought I had died or something." The C-54 takes off into the frozen Alaskan sky. It's a beast of a plane. 4 engines, built like a tank, the military version of the DC-4 commercial airliner. These things were workhorses. They flew supply runs across the Atlantic during World War II. They were reliable. They didn't just fall out of the sky. 2 hours into the flight, the pilot radios a checkpoint near Snag, Yukon, one of the coldest places on Earth. His voice is calm, professional. He reports ice building up on the wings, but nothing unusual for winter flying in the north. He confirms his altitude, 10,000 feet. Everything is under control. That's the last transmission anyone ever receives from the plane. The C-54 Skymaster, carrying 44 souls, vanishes into the white void of the Yukon wilderness. And despite one of the largest search operations in North American history, 85 planes, 7,000 troops, over 60,000 flight miles, they never find a trace. Not a piece of fuselage, not a seat cushion, not a body. 44 people boarded a plane, flew into the Arctic, and simply ceased to exist. Let me give you some context here, because this isn't just another missing plane story. This is 44 people. To put that in perspective, that's more than the number of passengers on many modern regional jets. When we talk about aviation mysteries, we usually think of solo pilots or small private planes, 2, 3, maybe 5 people. This was a flying bus full of human beings, and it disappeared without a whisper. The Douglas C-54 Skymaster is important to understand. This wasn't some fragile little Cessna held together with duct tape and prayers. The C-54 was a 4-engine military transport, 94 feet long with a 117-foot wingspan. Picture a building with wings. It weighed over 30 tons when fully loaded. It was designed to haul cargo and troops across oceans. During World War II, these planes carried supplies over the Himalayas on the infamous Hump route, one of the most dangerous flight paths in history. They were built to survive. But there was one critical limitation. The C-54 was unpressurized. That meant it couldn't fly high, usually no higher than 10,000 feet, because at higher altitudes, the crew and passengers would suffer hypoxia and pass out. In the Yukon, where the mountains jut up to 10,000 feet or more, this was a problem. The plane had to thread through narrow valleys and passes, staying low, navigating by sight in an era before GPS or modern radar. Now, let's talk about the passengers. Most were military, soldiers, airmen, support staff. But the presence of civilians makes this tragedy hit differently. Joyce Espay was pregnant, traveling with her young son. She was someone's wife, someone's daughter. She had a name, a story, a future that ended in the frozen mountains. Sergeant Junior Lee Moore had literally joked about dying in his last letter home. The cruel irony of that haunts you. The date matters too, January 26, 1950. This is deep winter in the Yukon. The region is infamous for cold. Just 3 years earlier, the nearby town of Snag recorded the lowest temperature ever measured in North America, 80 Horondag. When this plane took off, it was flying into an environment so hostile that metal becomes brittle. Fuel lines freeze and visibility can drop to 0 in seconds when snow squalls roll in. But the pilot knew all this. He was experienced. He'd flown this route before, and the C-54 was designed for exactly this kind of mission. Everything should have been fine. Let's walk through what happened step by step, because the details here matter. Morning, January 26, 1950. The C-54 departs Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage. The flight plan is straightforward. Fly east across Alaska, cut through the Yukon Territory, and land in Great Falls, Montana. It's a long haul, several hours, but routine. The plane is packed, 44 people crammed into a military transport. It's not luxurious. No in-flight meal service, no reclining seats, just rows of bench seating, maybe a few cargo pallets strapped down in the back. It's cold, loud, and uncomfortable, but it's normal for the era. 2 hours in, the pilot radios the station at Snag, Yukon. This is a tiny outpost right on the Alaska-Yukon border, basically the middle of nowhere. It's a relay station for aircraft. The pilot checks in. His voice is steady. He reports, "All is well. Ice on the wings." Now, ice on the wings is not ideal, but it's not an immediate emergency either, not for an experienced pilot. Ice forms when moisture in the clouds freezes on the aircraft's surfaces. It adds weight and disrupts the aerodynamics, making the plane harder to control and more likely to stall. But pilots in the 1950s dealt with icing all the time. You adjust your altitude, try to find warmer air, or push through. The pilot's tone suggests he's monitoring the situation, not panicking. He confirms his altitude, 10,000 feet. He's flying low, right at the edge of the plane's operational ceiling. Below him, the Yukon Mountains rise like teeth. Above him, the clouds are thick and heavy, and that's it. That's the last anyone hears from him. Next checkpoint, the plane is supposed to check in at Aishihik, 100 miles east. It never does. Radio operators wait, and wait, nothing. By evening, the alarm is raised. The C-54 is officially overdue and presumed down. And then the search begins. And my God, the scale of the search. The operation was called Operation Mike, and it was a joint U.S.-Canadian effort. They threw everything at it. The U.S. Air Force deployed C-47 search planes, C-130 cargo transports, helicopters. The Royal Canadian Air Force joined in. Even civilian volunteers took to the skies. At the peak, there were 85 aircraft searching simultaneously. Over 7,000 troops on the ground, combing the wilderness on foot and by dog sled. They covered over 350,000 square miles of frozen tundra, forest, and mountains. They flew low, scanning for wreckage. They looked for scorch marks from a fuel fire. They looked for aluminum glinting in the snow. They looked for smoke. They looked for anything. They found nothing. February 1st, 1950. 5 days into the search, a breakthrough, or so it seemed. An indigenous trapper near Aishihik reports hearing a massive crash, like thunder, coming from a specific ridge. He says he saw birds circling the area afterward, the way carrion birds do when there's a kill. Search planes are diverted to that location. They fly over it dozens of times. Nothing. February 13th, 1950. The search is effectively abandoned, not because they gave up, but because something else happened. A B-36 bomber carrying a Mark IV nuclear bomb crashes off the coast of British Columbia. Suddenly, every available aircraft and every pair of military eyes is redirected to finding that nuke. The missing C-54, tragic as it is, becomes a secondary concern. The search for the Skymaster quietly fades away. So the official explanation goes like this: the plane hit a mountain or crashed into a glacier, and the wreckage is buried under decades of snow and ice. Tragic, but case closed. Except that explanation has some massive holes. Let's pick it apart. Problem 1. The wreckage problem. A Douglas C-54 Skymaster is not a small object. We're talking about a plane that's 94 feet long, with a 117-foot wingspan, weighing over 30 tons fully loaded. It's made of aluminum, steel, glass, rubber, fabric. When something that big hits a mountain at 200 miles per hour, it doesn't just disappear. It explodes. It leaves a debris field. We're talking hundreds of pieces scattered across the landscape. Chunks of fuselage, engine blocks, propeller blades, landing gear, seats, luggage, fuel tanks. Even if the main wreckage is buried in a snowbank or wedged into a crevasse, something should be visible. A glint of metal, a piece of fabric fluttering in the wind, an oil slick melting through the snow. The searchers in 1950 were experienced. They knew what to look for. They flew low and slow, scanning every ridge, every valley, every frozen lake. They had 85 aircraft in the air at once. They covered 350,000 square miles. That's an area larger than Texas. And they found nothing. Now, some people argue that the plane crashed into a glacier and was immediately buried by fresh snowfall. Okay, that's theoretically possible. But here's the thing. Glaciers move. They're slow rivers of ice, grinding toward the sea at a rate of a few feet per year. Over the last 75 years, if the C-54 was entombed in a glacier, pieces of it should have started emerging by now. We've seen this happen with other lost aircraft. But from the Skymaster? Nothing. Ever. Problem 2. The Ranger sighting. Here's where it gets really weird. 2 days after the plane disappeared, January 28, 1950, a Canadian Ranger stationed in a remote area reports seeing a C-54 flying low through a valley. He describes it struggling, laboring through the air with visible ice buildup on the wings. He says the plane was so low he could make out details. He even waved at it. But here's the kicker. He was miles away from where the main search operation was focused. Was this the missing plane? Did it somehow stay airborne for 2 extra days, limping through the mountains, trying to find a place to land? Did the searchers look in the wrong place? Or was the Ranger mistaken? Did he see a different C-54? The problem is, there weren't that many C-54s flying around the Yukon in January 1950. Operation Sweetbriar was just gearing up, and most of the military traffic was still concentrated near Anchorage and Whitehorse. A lone C-54, struggling with ice, miles off course? That matches the missing plane almost perfectly. But if it was still flying on January 28th, why didn't the pilot radio for help? Why didn't the searchers spot it? Problem 3. The phantom radio signals. And then there's the creepiest part of all. In the days following the disappearance, radio operators at multiple stations reported picking up faint, garbled transmissions on the emergency frequency. The signals were weak, breaking up, almost unintelligible. But they were there. Some operators believed they were hearing a distress call. Others thought it might be a handheld emergency radio, a Gibson Girl transmitter that survivors could crank by hand to send an SOS. Search planes were diverted to try to triangulate the signals, but every time they got close, the signal would fade or disappear entirely. Some chalked it up to atmospheric interference, sunspots, magnetic anomalies, the usual explanations. But others wondered, what if it was the plane? What if they'd managed to crash land somewhere and survivors were trying to call for help? The problem is, a C-54 carries 6 hours of fuel. Even if they stretched it, they'd run dry within a day. So how could signals be coming from the plane days later? Unless they landed somewhere. Unless they survived the crash. Unless they were sitting in the wreckage, injured and freezing, cranking that radio, waiting for rescue that never came. That's the nightmare scenario, and it's entirely possible. So what happened to the Douglas C-54 Skymaster and the 44 people on board? The most likely explanation is still icing. The pilot reported ice on the wings. At 10,000 feet, threading through mountain passes with limited visibility and no modern instruments, he was flying on a razor's edge. The ice likely built up faster than he could compensate. The plane stalled, lost altitude, and hit a mountain or crashed into a frozen lake. The impact was catastrophic. The wreckage is buried somewhere in the 350,000 square miles of Yukon wilderness, under snow, under ice, under 75 years of forest growth, and we've just never found it. But that explanation requires you to accept that a plane the size of a building can vanish without leaving a trace. It requires you to dismiss the ranger's sighting as a mistake. It requires you to explain away the phantom radio signals as atmospheric noise. And maybe all of that is true. Maybe it's just bad luck in the vastness of the wilderness, but it's hard to shake the feeling that there's more to this story. What haunts me most is the human cost. 44 people, Joyce Esp and her son Victor, Sergeant Junior Lee Moore, men and women with families, with futures, with stories we'll never know. They boarded a plane on a cold January morning, expecting to be home in a few hours, and they just disappeared. This remains one of the largest groups of people to vanish simultaneously in aviation history without a trace. No bodies, no wreckage, no closure. 75 years later, the families are gone, the searchers are gone. But the C-54 Skymaster is still out there, somewhere in the frozen north, waiting to be found. 44 people flew into the white void, and they never came back. September 4th, 1978, Sterling, Alaska. It's late summer, but winter is already creeping in. The nights are getting longer. The air smells like wood smoke and pine needles. In a small cabin surrounded by dense spruce forest, 2 children are home alone. Scott Fandel is 13. His little sister, Amy, is 8. Their mother has gone out for the evening, visiting friends, maybe stopping at a local bar. This is rural Alaska in the 1970s. Leaving kids alone isn't unusual. They're tough. They know how to take care of themselves. Around midnight, Scott decides to make dinner. He's hungry. Amy's probably hungry too. He gets out a pot, fills it with water, and sets it on the stove to boil. He opens a can of tomatoes. He pulls out a box of macaroni. It's a simple meal, but it's something. The cabin is warm, the stove is heating up, everything is normal, and then something happens. When their mother, Margaret, comes home around 2 a.m., the cabin is dark and silent. She walks inside and immediately knows something is wrong. The pot of water is still on the stove, boiled dry, the metal scorched. The can of tomatoes is open on the counter. The macaroni box is sitting there, ready to go. But Scott and Amy are gone. No note, no explanation, no sign of struggle. The cabin is intact. The door was unlocked, or maybe it wasn't forced. There are no footprints leading away into the woods, no tire tracks in the driveway. It's as if the children were plucked out of the cabin by invisible hands. Scott and Amy Fandel vanished in the middle of making dinner. And despite decades of investigation, searches, and theories, no one has ever figured out what happened to them. They walked into the Alaskan night and never came back. This is the stuff of nightmares. Let me paint the picture for you because the setting is everything in this case. Sterling, Alaska is not a city, it's barely a town. In 1978, it was a scattered collection of cabins, trailers, and homesteads carved out of the wilderness on the Kenai Peninsula. The population was small, maybe a few hundred people, and everyone lived spread out, connected by dirt roads in a shared sense of isolation. This was the tail end of the Alaska pipeline boom. The state had seen an influx of workers and transients, but by '78, things were quieting down. People were settling into the rhythm of frontier life. The Fandel family lived in a cabin, or possibly a trailer, depending on which source you read, on a remote lot surrounded by forest. Dense, dark Alaskan forest, Sitka spruce, birch, alder, the kind of woods where you can be 10 feet off the trail and completely invisible. The kind of woods where bears wander through your yard and moose bed down in your driveway. The kind of woods where, if you scream, there's a good chance no one will hear you. Margaret Fandel was a single mother. She was doing her best to raise two kids in a tough environment. Scott, at 13, was old enough to be responsible. He wasn't a little kid anymore. He could cook, handle chores, keep an eye on his sister. Amy, at 8, was small, just 52 pounds, but she was a wilderness kid. She knew the rules. Don't go outside after dark, don't wander off, stay close to the cabin. On the night of September 4th, 1978, a Monday, Labor Day, Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She left Scott and Amy alone and went out with her sister Kathy. They visited friends. They hit a local bar. This wasn't unusual for the time and place. In 1970s Alaska, the latchkey kid phenomenon was amplified by necessity. Parents worked long hours or socialized on rare nights off, and kids were expected to manage. It wasn't neglect. It was survival. But on this night, something went wrong. Let's walk through the timeline carefully, because every detail matters. Afternoon, September 4th, 1978. The children are seen during the day. They're playing, visiting a neighbor's house, acting completely normal. There's no indication that anything is wrong. They're not scared. They're not planning to run away. They're just kids being kids. Evening, Margaret and her sister Kathy leave the cabin. The sun is setting. Scott and Amy are inside, safe and warm. The cabin is their fortress. Late night, midnight to 1 a.m. At some point, Scott decides to make dinner. He's 13. He's hungry. He knows how to use the stove. He fills a pot with water and puts it on the burner to boil. He opens a can of tomatoes with a manual can opener, one of those old-school ones that leaves a jagged edge. He sets the can on the counter. He pulls out a box of macaroni, ready to dump it in once the water boils. And then, something interrupts him. Around 2 a.m., Margaret and Kathy return to the cabin. The first thing Margaret notices is the darkness. No lights are on. The cabin is silent. She walks inside and immediately sees the kitchen. The pot of water is still on the stove, but the water has boiled away. The metal is scorched and discolored from the heat. The can of tomatoes is sitting open on the counter. The macaroni box is right there, untouched. But Scott and Amy are gone. Margaret searches the cabin. She checks the bedrooms. She checks outside. She calls their names. Nothing. No response. No trace. She checks the surroundings. There are no footprints in the dirt leading away from the cabin. No disturbed vegetation. No signs that the children walked into the woods. The family vehicle is still there. No one drove away. It's as if they evaporated. Margaret and Kathy call the police. The Alaska State Troopers arrive and begin an investigation. Search teams are mobilized. Volunteers comb the woods. Dogs are brought in. But days turn into weeks, and there's nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no clues. Scott and Amy Fandel are simply gone. Now, over the years, several theories have emerged. Let's go through them one by one and tear them apart, because none of them actually make sense. Theory 1. The runaway. Theory. Some people have suggested that Scott and Amy ran away. Maybe they were unhappy. Maybe they were scared of something. Maybe they planned to meet someone or hitchhike to Anchorage. Here's the problem with that. They were making dinner. Think about it. You're 13 years old. You've decided to run away. You're planning your escape. Are you really going to stop, fill a pot with water, open a can of tomatoes, and start boiling macaroni? No. You're going to pack a bag. You're going to grab some food. Maybe that can of tomatoes unopened to take with you. You're going to put on your shoes and your coat and sneak out the door. Scott and Amy left no bags packed. No extra clothes were missing. They were wearing what they had on. Scott in a striped t-shirt and jeans, Amy in a sweater, vest, and jeans. They didn't take money. They didn't take supplies. And most importantly, they were in the middle of cooking. You don't start a pot of boiling water if you're about to walk out the door forever. The dinner on the stove is the smoking gun. It tells us they weren't planning to leave. They were interrupted. Theory 2. The animal attack. Alaska is full of predators. Bears, wolves, even the occasional lynx. Maybe a bear broke into the cabin and attacked the children. Except the cabin was intact. If a bear forces its way into a structure, it leaves evidence. Doors are splintered, windows are smashed, furniture is overturned. There's blood, lots of it. Bear attacks are violent and messy. The scene would look like a war zone. The Fandel cabin showed no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no scratched doors, no overturned chairs. The pot was still on the stove. The can of tomatoes was sitting upright on the counter. Everything was in place. And if a bear had dragged the children outside, there would be a trail. Blood in the dirt, drag marks, torn clothing snagged on branches. The search teams found none of that. No forensic evidence of a predator attack. Theory 3. The abduction. This is the theory that law enforcement has focused on for decades. Someone came to the cabin, someone the children knew, or someone who convinced them to open the door, and took them. This is the most plausible explanation, but it raises its own set of terrifying questions. First, who? The obvious suspect is someone close to the family. Margaret's estranged husband was investigated, but there's no evidence linking him to the disappearance. He was never charged. He passed away years later, taking any potential secrets to the grave. There were also rumors of transient workers, men who'd come up for the pipeline boom and were still drifting through Alaska in '78. Sterling had its share of rough characters, but no one was ever arrested. No credible witness ever came forward. Second, how? If someone abducted the children, how did they do it without leaving a trace? No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of struggle. The only way this works is if the children willingly walked out with the person. Maybe someone they trusted. Maybe someone who said, "Your mom needs help," or "Come with me for just a minute." But here's the detail that doesn't fit. Scott was 13. He was old enough to be suspicious. He was old enough to resist. If a stranger showed up at the door, he wouldn't just hand his little sister over and walk into the night, not without a fight. Not without trying to run or scream or defend himself, unless it was someone he knew, someone he trusted, someone who disarmed his defenses before it was too late. Now, here is the detail that elevates this case into Alaska Triangle territory. Multiple sources confirm that there were no footprints leading away from the cabin. No tracks in the dirt driveway, no disturbed vegetation in the woods. Think about that. 2 children, one 13, one 8, leave a cabin in the middle of the night. They walk across dirt, through grass, maybe into the woods, and they leave no trace, no heel prints, no scuff marks, nothing. How is that possible? Some have speculated that the perpetrator carried them, both of them, to a vehicle parked on the main road. But Scott weighed 74 pounds. Amy weighed 52 pounds. That's 126 pounds of struggling, frightened children. Even a strong adult would have difficulty carrying both of them any significant distance without dropping something, a shoe, a piece of clothing, or leaving deeper footprints from the added weight. The lack of physical evidence is baffling. It's as if the children floated out of the cabin. So what happened to Scott and Amy Fandel? The most likely explanation is still abduction. Someone came to that cabin on the night of September 4th, 1978. Someone the children opened the door for, or someone who forced their way in so quietly and efficiently that there was no struggle. That person took Scott and Amy, either in a vehicle or on foot, to a location where they were killed and their bodies hidden so well that decades of searching have never uncovered them. But the questions remain. Who was it? How did they leave no evidence? And why has no one, not a deathbed confession, not a discovered burial site, not a shred of forensic evidence, ever surfaced in over 45 years? The case is still open. The Alaska State Troopers still list Scott and Amy as missing. There are age-progressed photos showing what they might look like today. Scott in his late 50s, Amy in her early 50s. But no one really believes they're still alive. The hope now is for recovery, for closure, for their mother, Margaret, to finally know what happened to her children. What haunts me most about this case is the dinner, that pot of water, that open can of tomatoes, that box of macaroni sitting on the counter, ready to be cooked. It's such a mundane, domestic image. A 13-year-old boy making a late-night snack for himself and his little sister. A moment of normalcy in a remote Alaskan cabin. And then, in the span of minutes, maybe seconds, everything changed. The water boiled dry. The stove burned. and 2 children walked out of that cabin and were erased from the world. Scott and Amy Fandel never got to eat the dinner they were making. And somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, their story remains unfinished, a pot left boiling on a stove that will never be turned off. Late fall, 1976, the Porcupine River, northeast Alaska. This is the edge of the world. We're talking Arctic Circle territory, about 16 miles from the Canadian border. The landscape is a mix of black spruce forest, tundra, and freezing water that cuts through the wilderness like a vein. The daylight is shrinking fast. In a few weeks, the sun will barely rise above the horizon. Winter is coming, and when winter hits this far north, it doesn't mess around. Temperatures drop to 40, 50 below zero. The river freezes solid. The world goes silent. Into this environment walks a 25-year-old man named Gary Frank Southerden. He's from Clay, New York, upstate near Syracuse. He's a long way from home. Gary isn't a tourist. He's not some weekend warrior playing at survival. He's an adventurer, a free spirit who spent the last few years drifting across the U.S. and Canada. He worked on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, one of the biggest construction projects in history, and now that the work is slowing down, he's decided to do what a lot of young men did in the 1970s, test himself against the Alaskan wilderness. He's hunting, trapping, living the dream. He and a partner fly into a remote area along the Porcupine River. The plan is simple. They'll hunt on opposite sides of the river, cover more ground and meet up later. It's a calculated risk. They're experienced. They've got gear. They've got rifles. What could go wrong? Gary Southerden never makes it back to the rendezvous point. His family waits. Weeks turn into months. Search efforts are launched, but this is 1976. There's no GPS, no cell phones, no satellite tracking. If you disappear in the Alaskan bush, you're gone. The wilderness swallows you whole, and that's what happens. Gary vanishes. His parents eventually erect a tombstone in a cemetery back in New York. It reads, "Lost in Alaska." But here's where the story gets strange. 21 years later, in 1997, a hunter is walking along the Porcupine River, about 8 miles from the Canadian border. He's scanning the underbrush and he sees something white. At first, he thinks it's a rock, but as he gets closer, he realizes it's not a rock. It's a skull, a human skull. Bleached by the sun, weathered by decades of snow and rain, sitting alone on the riverbank like some grim artifact. The skull is recovered. It's logged as a John Doe. And for the next 25 years, it sits in a box in an evidence room waiting for technology to catch up. In 2022, 46 years after Gary disappeared, DNA genealogy finally solves the mystery. The skull is Gary's. His brother Steve gets the call he never expected. After nearly half a century, the family has an answer, sort of. Because here's the thing, finding the skull raises more questions than it answers. What happened to the rest of Gary? Where's his gear? And how did a 25-year-old experienced hunter vanish so completely that only a single bone survived to tell the tale? Let me set the scene. Because the Porcupine River in late 1976 is about as remote and hostile as you can get on this planet. We're north of the Arctic Circle. The Porcupine River flows through the interior of Alaska, eventually feeding into the Yukon River. In the fall, it's a landscape of stark beauty. Gold and red tundra, dark spruce forests, and icy water that'll kill you in minutes if you fall in. The wildlife is abundant, grizzly bears fattening up before hibernation, black bears, wolves, moose, caribou. It's a hunter's paradise. It's also a place where nature is utterly indifferent to your survival. Gary Frank Southerden was 25 years old, but he wasn't naive. He'd grown up in upstate New York, so he knew cold. He knew woods. And crucially, he'd spent time working on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. That was a job that attracted tough, adventurous people. Guys who could handle isolation, extreme weather, and physical hardship. Gary fit the profile. He wasn't some city kid playing at wilderness survival. He was the real deal. His brother Steve describes him as independent, a traveler, someone who'd crisscrossed the US and Canada seeking adventure. When the pipeline work slowed down in 1976, Gary didn't go home. he stayed in Alaska. He wanted to hunt, he wanted to trap. He wanted to live like the old-timers, the trappers and prospectors who'd carved out a living in the bush a century before. So Gary and a hunting partner chartered a bush plane and flew into the Porcupine River area. The plan was straightforward. They'd set up camp, hunt for a few days, and then fly back out. To cover more ground, they made a decision that, in hindsight, was a fatal mistake. They agreed to hunt on opposite sides of the river. They'd work independently and meet up later. It's the kind of decision that seems reasonable at the time. You're experienced. You've got a rifle. You've got gear. What's the worst that could happen? Gary Sotherden found out. Let's walk through the decades, because this story unfolds in slow motion. Fall 1976. Gary and his partner separate. Gary heads to his side of the river, rifle in hand, ready to hunt. Days pass. When it's time to meet up, Gary doesn't show. His partner waits. He searches. He calls out. Nothing. Eventually, the partner makes it back to civilization and raises the alarm. Alaska State Troopers are notified. A search is launched. Bush pilots fly over the area. Volunteers comb the riverbanks. But the Porcupine River area is vast. It's hundreds of square miles of trackless wilderness, and by the time the search gets underway, winter is closing in, the snow is falling, the river is freezing. If Gary's out there, injured or dead, the elements are erasing all evidence. The search turns up nothing. Spring 1977. Gary's parents refuse to give up. They hire a mountain guide, a former high school friend of Gary's who knows the area, and send him to the Porcupine River to search by canoe. It's a long shot, but it's all they can do. The guide finds Gary's campsite, and at the campsite, he finds two critical pieces of evidence: Gary's driver's license and his broken glasses. Now, this is a huge clue. A hunter doesn't just abandon his glasses. If your glasses are broken, you're in serious trouble. You can't see clearly. You can't aim your rifle. You can't navigate. You're vulnerable. The broken glasses suggest violence, a struggle, a fall, an attack, something that left Gary injured and disoriented. But there's no sign of Gary himself. No body, no bones. The guide brings the license and glasses back to the family, and they're forced to accept the worst. Gary is gone. They hold a memorial service. A tombstone is erected in Pine Plains Cemetery in Clay, New York. It says, "Lost in Alaska." The case goes cold. July 1997, 21 years pass. Gary's family has moved on as best they can. And then, in the summer of 1997, a hunter is walking along the Porcupine River about 8 miles from the Canadian border. He's in a remote area, no trails, no roads, just wilderness. And he sees something in the brush, something white, half buried in the dirt and leaves. It's a human skull. He contacts authorities. Alaska State Troopers recover the skull and send it to forensic experts. The skull shows signs of trauma, specific markings that look like tooth penetrations, not human teeth, animal teeth, big animal teeth. The spacing and size are consistent with a bear, either a grizzly or a black bear. But here's the problem. There's only the skull. No other bones, no clothing, no boots, no rifle. Just a single piece of a human being sitting alone on the riverbank, 21 years after Gary Sotherden disappeared. The skull is cataloged as a John Doe and stored in an evidence room. In 1997, DNA technology isn't advanced enough to extract a usable profile from old weathered bone, so the skull sits and waits. 2022, fast forward 25 more years. By 2022, DNA technology has made incredible leaps. Forensic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer, is now being used to solve cold cases across the country. Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit decides to take another look at the Porcupine River skull. They extract DNA from the bone, they upload the profile to genealogy databases, and they get a hit, a second cousin match. The investigators trace the family tree and narrow it down to a specific family. They reach out to Steve Sotherden, Gary's brother. Steve had recently taken a 23andMe test, just out of curiosity, to learn about his ancestry. He had no idea the test would solve a 46-year-old mystery. The troopers compare Steve's DNA to the skull, It's a match. The skull belongs to Gary Frank Sotherden. In December 2022, Steve gets the call. After 46 years, his brother has been found. Sort of. Okay, so the official theory, the one the Alaska Bureau of Investigation put forward, is that Gary was killed by a bear. The evidence, tooth marks on the skull. The logic, he was hunting in grizzly and black bear country during a season when bears are aggressive and hungry. But let's dig into this because the bear attack theory has some serious problems. Problem 1, the isolated skull. A bear attack is brutal, it's violent, it's messy. When a bear kills a human, it usually does one of two things. It either defends its territory and leaves the body alone, or it treats the human as food and consumes parts of it. But in both scenarios, there's a scene, there's torn clothing, there are scattered bones, there's the victim's gear, rifle, backpack, boots, left behind because bears don't eat metal or rubber. Gary's skull was found alone. No other bones nearby, no ribs, no femurs, no vertebrae, just the skull. Now, it's possible that scavengers, wolves, foxes, ravens, came along after the bear and scattered the remains. That happens. But over 21 years, you'd expect something else to turn up. Hikers, hunters, and trappers pass through that area. The Porcupine River floods every spring, washing debris downstream and exposing buried objects. Yet, in the 46 years since Gary disappeared, only the skull has been found. That's statistically weird. Problem 2, the missing gear. Gary was carrying a rifle. He had a backpack. He had boots, leather or rubber, materials that don't decompose quickly. He had a knife, probably a metal canteen, maybe a compass. Where is all of that? If a bear killed him at his campsite, where his broken glasses were found, then his gear should be there too. But the guide who found the campsite in 1977 reported finding only the license and glasses, no rifle, no pack, no body. If Gary was killed away from camp, say while tracking an animal, then his body and gear should be in the same general area. But again, only the skull turned up. One explanation is that the river took everything. The Porcupine is a powerful waterway. It floods, it shifts course. Maybe Gary's body ended up in the water, and the current scattered his remains and gear over miles of riverbed. But metal doesn't decompose. A rifle doesn't just vanish. Someone, somewhere, should have found it. Problem 3, the tooth marks. The forensic experts noted tooth penetrations on the skull consistent with a bear. But here's the question. Were those marks made before or after Gary died? Bears scavenge. If Gary died of hypothermia, or drowned in the river, or suffered a fatal injury from something else, a bear could have found his body weeks or months later and fed on it. The tooth marks don't necessarily mean the bear killed him. They just mean a bear interacted with his remains at some point. Steve Sotherden, Gary's brother, said that learning his brother was killed by a bear was actually more brutal than the scenario the family had imagined, that Gary simply froze to death or got lost. But the forensic evidence isn't definitive. The medical examiner couldn't say for certain that the bear attack was the cause of death. It's a theory. A good theory, but not a proven fact. And here's where the case starts to feel like a classic Alaska Triangle mystery. Gary Sotherden didn't just disappear. He was erased. Almost every trace of him, his body, his gear, his story, was wiped from existence. For 21 years, it was as if he'd never been there at all. And then, suddenly, the wilderness gave back a single piece, a skull sitting on a riverbank, waiting to be found. It's the same pattern we see in other Alaska Triangle cases. The landscape seems to selectively delete evidence, leaving behind just enough to haunt you, but not enough to give you closure. So what happened to Gary Frank Sotherden? The most likely explanation is still the one the investigators settled on. He was killed by a bear. He was hunting in dangerous country. He separated from his partner, which meant he had no backup. He encountered a grizzly or a black bear. Maybe he surprised it, maybe it was territorial, maybe it was just hungry, and the bear attacked. The struggle was brief and violent. Gary didn't survive. Over the following weeks, months, and years, scavengers and the elements scattered his remains. The Porcupine River flooded, washing bones and gear downstream. The harsh winters buried and preserved some pieces while destroying others, and by sheer chance, the skull ended up on a riverbank where, 21 years later, a hunter happened to walk by and spot it. That's the rational explanation. And maybe it's true, but there's something deeply unsettling about the idea that a human being can be reduced to a single bone, that after 46 years of searching, investigating, and waiting, all that's left of Gary Southerden is a skull with tooth marks and a lot of unanswered questions. Steve Southerden got closure, in a way. He knows what happened to his brother, or at least he knows the broad strokes, but he'll never know the specifics. Was Gary scared? Did he suffer? Did he call out for help? Those details are lost forever, buried in the Alaskan wilderness. The Porcupine River kept Gary's secret for 46 years, and even now it's only given back a piece of the story. The rest, the truth of his final moments, the location of his gear, the scattered remains of his body, is still out there, somewhere in the frozen north, waiting for someone to find it. Or maybe, like so many Alaska Triangle mysteries, it'll never be found at all. Gary Frank Southerden went into the wilderness looking for adventure, and the wilderness kept him. August 21st, 2010. King Salmon, Alaska. It's a beautiful summer day. Clear blue skies, light winds, excellent visibility. Perfect flying weather. At the Branch River Air Service hangar, a de Havilland Beaver, one of the most iconic bush planes ever built, is being prepped for a routine flight. The Beaver is a legend in Alaska. It's the workhorse of the North, designed in the 1940s and still flying strong. These planes are nearly indestructible. They can land on water, on gravel bars, on tundra. They're built for Alaska. The pilot is Marco Aleto, 47 years old, a seasoned commercial pilot who knows this route like the back of his hand. He's flown for Branch River Air Service for years. He's careful, professional, not the kind of guy who takes unnecessary risks. His passengers are three young men, Mason McLeod, 26, and brothers Neil and Seth Spradlin, 28 and 20. They're National Park Service employees, maintenance workers for Katmai National Park. They've been out at a remote ranger station doing repairs, and now they're heading back to King Salmon. It's supposed to be a quick hop, maybe 30 minutes in the air. They're in good spirits. They're heading home. Marco radios to confirm his departure. The plane lifts off. And then, nothing. No distress call, no mayday, no emergency beacon. The Beaver just disappears. It never lands in King Salmon. It never checks in with air traffic control. It's as if the plane flew into an invisible hole in the sky. For weeks, search teams scour the wilderness. Friends, family, the Coast Guard, the National Park Service. Everyone is out there, flying grid patterns, searching lakes, checking crash sites. They fly over 60,000 miles. That's more than twice around the Earth. And they find nothing. It takes over a month before a helicopter pilot spots something. Wreckage. Scattered pieces of a plane, washed up on a remote beach. The tail section is there, with the registration number still visible. N9313Z, Marco Aleto's Beaver. But here's what haunts everyone who worked this case. The weather was perfect. The plane was reliable. The pilot was experienced. This was supposed to be the safest flight imaginable. It was a 30-minute trip in broad daylight with no storms, no mechanical issues, and no reason to crash. And yet, 4 men flew into the sky and never came back. Let me give you some context because understanding the environment and the equipment is critical here. King Salmon is a small town on the Alaska Peninsula. Population around 400. It's a hub for sport fishing and wilderness tourism. In the summer, bush planes are constantly coming and going, ferrying fishermen, hunters, and park workers to remote lodges and ranger stations scattered across Katmai National Park. This is what these planes were built for. It's routine. It's safe. Or at least, it's supposed to be. The de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver is one of the most beloved aircraft in aviation history. It was designed in Canada in 1947 specifically for bush flying. It's a single-engine high-wing plane with a boxy utilitarian look. It seats 6 to 8 people, depending on configuration. It's slow. Cruising speed is only about 140 mph, but it's tough. These planes have been flying in Alaska for over 60 years. They can handle rough weather, short runways, and heavy loads. Pilots love them because they're forgiving. They don't quit on you. The Beaver that Marco Aletto was flying, tail number N9313Z, was manufactured in 1952. It was 58 years old at the time of the crash. Now, that might sound alarming, but in the world of bush planes, age isn't necessarily a red flag. These aircraft are meticulously maintained. They're rebuilt, inspected, and certified. A well-maintained Beaver from the 1950s can be safer than a brand new plane that's poorly cared for. And Branch River Air Service had a solid reputation. They weren't cutting corners. Marco Aletto was the kind of pilot you'd want flying you. He was 47, experienced, and by all accounts, cautious. He wasn't a cowboy. He didn't push limits. He flew for a living, which meant he had a vested interest in coming home alive every single day. People who knew him described him as professional and meticulous. The passengers were just regular guys doing their jobs. Mason McLeod was 26, a maintenance worker for the National Park Service. Neil and Seth Spradlin were brothers from Indiana. Neil was 28, Seth was 20. They'd been out at Swickshack Lagoon, a remote ranger station in Katmai, doing repairs. They'd been stuck there for days because of bad weather, waiting for a window to fly out. August 21st was that window. The weather had cleared. It was time to go home. Everything about this flight screamed routine. Let's walk through the day because every detail matters. 1:52 p.m., August 21st, 2010, Marco Aletto takes off from Swickshack Lagoon in the de Havilland Beaver. On board, Mason McLeod, Neil Spradlin, and Seth Spradlin. Destination, King Salmon, about 100 miles away. Flight time, roughly 30 to 40 minutes. The weather is excellent. No storms, no fog. Visibility is clear. This is as good as it gets for flying in Alaska. About 15 minutes after Marco takes off, a second Branch River Air Service plane, a Cessna 206, departs from the same location. The pilot of the Cessna is following the same route, heading back to King Salmon. This is important because it gives us a second set of eyes in the sky. During the flight, the Cessna pilot encounters low clouds. He's forced to fly at about 500 feet above the ground, following river drainages to maintain visual contact with the terrain. This is called scud running, flying under the clouds. It's legal, but it's risky because your margin for error is slim. If you misjudge your altitude or hit an unexpected downdraft, you're in trouble. At some point during the flight, the Cessna pilot hears Marco on the radio. Marco says he's found a hole, a gap in the clouds, and he's descending through it near Big River. This is the last communication anyone hears from Marco Aletto. Around 2:12 p.m., the Beaver fails to arrive in King Salmon. The plane is officially overdue. The alarm is raised immediately. In Alaska, when a plane doesn't show up on time, you don't wait. You start searching. Weather can change in minutes. Fuel runs out. If someone's down, every second counts. The response is massive. The National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Alaska State Troopers, and the Coast Guard all mobilize. Helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground teams fan out across the search area. Friends and family charter planes to help. Volunteers scour the coastline. They fly grid patterns over mountains, lakes, and rivers. They search for days, then weeks. They cover over 60,000 air miles. That's the equivalent of flying from New York to London and back 6 times. And they find nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no smoke, no debris floating in the water. It's as if the Beaver and everyone on board simply evaporated. September 21st, 2010, 1 month later. A helicopter pilot named Sam Egley is flying over a remote stretch of coastline near Sukhoi Bay, about 28 miles from where the plane was supposed to be. He spots something on the beach. Debris. He lands to investigate. It's wreckage, pieces of an airplane. He finds the tail section with the registration number still visible, N931Z, Marco's plane. The wreckage is scattered along the beach, washed ashore by the tide, but there's no main fuselage. No engine, no bodies, just fragments, pieces of wing, bits of metal, personal belongings. And here's the detail that changes everything. Among the wreckage, investigators find a tent and a duffel bag belonging to the passengers. The items show evidence of fire. But not just any fire. There's a very sharp, very distinct line between the burned and unburned portions of the fabric. The NTSB investigators realize what this means. The tent and duffel bag were floating. They were bobbing on the surface of the water, and a layer of burning aviation fuel was floating on top of the water around them. The fire burned the upper portions of the items, while the water protected the lower portions. It's a phenomenon called a fuel slick fire. This tells us the plane didn't crash on land. It crashed into water, either a lake or the ocean. The impact was violent enough to rupture the fuel tanks, thus spilling gasoline onto the surface. The fuel ignited, probably from the hot engine or a spark, and the luggage floated through the flames before drifting away. Okay, so the official conclusion from the NTSB is that the plane crashed into water due to pilot disorientation or controlled flight into terrain. But let's pick that apart, because there are some serious problems with that explanation. Problem 1. The weather. Let's talk about the conditions. Yes, there were clouds. The Cessna pilot reported flying low to stay under them. But the weather wasn't bad. It wasn't a whiteout. It wasn't a storm. It was typical Alaskan coastal weather. Some clouds, some clear patches, manageable for an experienced pilot. Marco Aletto wasn't a rookie. He'd flown this route countless times. He knew the terrain. He knew the weather patterns. And he had the option to turn back if conditions deteriorated. The fact that he radioed about finding a hole in the clouds suggests he was actively managing the situation, making decisions, staying in control. So why would he fly into the water? Pilot disorientation usually happens in whiteout conditions or at night when you lose all visual references. But it was mid-afternoon. The sun was up. The visibility was decent. How does an experienced pilot in a slow, stable aircraft lose track of where the sky ends and the water begins? Problem 2. The emergency locator transmitter. Here we go again, the ELT. Every aircraft is required to carry one. It's designed to activate automatically when the plane experiences a high G-force impact, like a crash. The ELT then broadcasts a distress signal on an emergency frequency, helping searchers locate the wreckage. In the Branch River crash, the ELT never activated, or if it did, no one heard it. There were some faint, unconfirmed signals detected days later, but nothing that led searchers to the crash site. Now, there are explanations for why an ELT might fail. If the antenna is sheared off on impact, the signal can't transmit. If the plane sinks immediately, the water can muffle or block the signal. But the fact that ELTs fail so often in Alaska Triangle cases is unsettling. It's like the one piece of technology designed to save lives in a crash just doesn't work when you need it most. Problem 3. The invisibility. This is the part that keeps me up at night. Searchers flew over 60,000 miles. They covered the entire flight path, plus a massive buffer zone around it. They used helicopters, which can fly low and slow, perfect for spotting wreckage. They had the Coast Guard scanning the coastline. They had volunteers who knew the area intimately. And for an entire month, they saw nothing. The wreckage was eventually found on a beach near Sukhoi Bay, about 28 miles from the departure point. This wasn't some hidden valley or dense forest. It was a beach. The tail section was sitting there, visible from the air. How did dozens of search planes miss it for 30 days? There are theories. Maybe the wreckage was initially underwater or buried in sand, and a storm uncovered it later. Maybe the tides shifted debris around, and it only washed ashore after weeks of searching. But those explanations feel thin. The tail section is big. It's a significant piece of structure. It should have been spotted earlier. And this brings up something the locals talk about, the land hiding things. There's this idea in Alaska, especially in areas like Katmai, that the wilderness doesn't give up its dead easily. It conceals, it delays, it reveals evidence only when it's ready. Whether that's superstition or just a reflection of how disorienting and vast the landscape is, I don't know. But the pattern holds. Problem 4. The survivors' gear. The wreckage that was found was fragmentary, pieces of the plane, personal items, But the main fuselage, the part that would contain the bodies and the engine, was never recovered. The assumption is that it sank in deep water, in a lake or in Shelikof Strait. But here's what bothers me. Aviation fuel floats, seat cushions float, life jackets float, bodies float eventually. If the plane crashed into a lake or the ocean, there should have been more floating debris, especially in the first few hours and days. Yet the searchers saw nothing until the beach discovery a month later. Did the plane crash into deep water and sink so fast that nothing escaped? That's possible. But a de Havilland Beaver doesn't sink like a rock. It's built with flotation in mind. Even a catastrophic crash usually leaves something on the surface. So what happened to Marco Aletto, Mason McLeod, Neil Spradlin, and Seth Spradlin? The most likely explanation is still the official one. Marco encountered low clouds or fog. He descended to try to stay visual with the terrain. In the process, he either became disoriented, mistaking the flat, glassy surface of a lake or the ocean for open sky, or he simply ran out of altitude. The plane hit the water at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage sank. The fuel ignited, burning the floating luggage. And over the following weeks, the lighter pieces of wreckage drifted with the currents until they washed ashore. That's the rational explanation, and it might be true. But it requires you to accept that an experienced pilot, flying a legendary aircraft on a clear day with perfect visibility, somehow flew straight into the water without realizing it. It requires you to believe that the ELT failed, and it requires you to accept that an entire fleet of search planes missed the wreckage for 30 days. What devastates me most about this case is the waiting. For 30 days, the families didn't know. They hoped, they prayed. They imagined scenarios where the guys had crash-landed safely and were just waiting to be found. Maybe they were injured but alive, camping by a lake, rationing food, listening for the sound of rescue planes. But the truth, when it finally came, was worse than not knowing. There were no survivors. There was no miracle. Just fragments of a plane on a beach and 4 lives erased. This was supposed to be the safest flight imaginable. Good pilot, good plane, good weather. A 30-minute hop in broad daylight, the kind of flight that happens 1,000 times a summer in Alaska without incident. But on August 21st, 2010, something went wrong, and 4 men flew into the sky and never came back. The Branch River Air Service tragedy is a reminder that in Alaska, even the safest bet can turn deadly. The wilderness doesn't care about your experience, your equipment, or your plans. It's beautiful, but it's unforgiving. And sometimes it takes what it wants and gives nothing back. October 11th, 2014, Anchorage, Alaska. It's late evening, and the city is settling into that strange twilight period that defines Alaskan autumns. The sun set hours ago. By this time of year, darkness comes early and stays late. There's already a dusting of snow on the ground. The temperature is hovering just above freezing. It's the kind of night where you hurry from your car to your front door, where you don't linger outside unless you have to. In South Anchorage, in the Trailside Loop area, a 20-year-old woman named Jael Hamblin is getting ready to go out. She's a young mother with a toddler. She's had her struggles. Who hasn't at 20? But she's working on building a better life. She recently dyed her hair pink, a splash of color and personality in the gray Alaskan winter. She's living with roommates, relying on a network of friends and family to help with childcare. It's not glamorous, but it's her life, and she's fighting to make it work. That night, Jael leaves her child with a roommate and heads out. Maybe she's meeting someone. Maybe she just needs a break, a few hours to feel like herself instead of mom. She's wearing a dark wool coat, a scarf, wide-leg jeans, and dark high heels. She's dressed up. This isn't survival gear. This is going out attire. She drives her white 1998 Ford Expedition, a massive SUV impossible to miss, into the Anchorage night, and then she disappears. 2 days later, her roommate reports her missing. The search begins. And what they find raises more questions than it answers. Jael's expedition is discovered abandoned in a parking lot on the outskirts of town. The keys are missing. Her purse is gone. There's no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. The car is just sitting there like she parked it, locked it, and walked away. But here's the thing. Young mothers don't just walk away from their children. Not like this. Not in the middle of an Alaskan winter without a coat, without a plan, without a word to anyone. And when you dig into the details, the timeline, the phone pings, the weather, the location, nothing about Jael Hamblin's disappearance makes sense. 10 years later, Jael is still missing. Her child is growing up without a mother. And somewhere in Anchorage, or in the wilderness just beyond it, the truth is buried under snow and silence. Let me set the scene, because Anchorage is not what most people imagine when they think of Alaska. Anchorage is a real city. It has over 300,000 people. There are shopping malls, chain restaurants, traffic lights, and suburban neighborhoods. It's modern, it's developed. But here's what makes it different from cities in the lower 48. The wilderness is right there. You can stand in a Walmart parking lot and see the Chugach Mountains looming over you, covered in snow. You can drive 5 minutes from downtown and be on a trail where grizzly bears and moose outnumber humans. Anchorage sits on the edge of the wild, and that edge is thinner than you think. The South Anchorage area, where Jael lived, is a mix of apartment complexes, single-family homes, and wooded lots. The Trailside Loop neighborhood is middle class, relatively safe, the kind of place where families live. But it's also close to the hillside, the eastern part of Anchorage that slopes up into the Chugach foothills. There are hiking trails, greenbelts, and dense spruce forests woven through the suburbs. It's beautiful, but it's also isolated. At night, the unlit streets and forested lots create pockets of darkness where anything can happen. Jael Tiara Hamblin was 20 years old. She stood 5'4" and weighed about 190 pounds. She had green eyes, and most distinctively, she'd recently dyed her hair bright pink. That detail matters. If you're planning to disappear, to run away and start a new life, you don't make yourself more visible. You blend in. You go back to your natural hair color. You fade into the background. Jael's pink hair suggests she wasn't planning to vanish. She was living her life, expressing herself, existing in the world. She had a young child, a toddler. By all accounts, she loved that kid. She was struggling financially, sure, and she was navigating the challenges of being a young single mother in an expensive city. But she hadn't abandoned her responsibilities. She was there. She was trying. On the night of October 11, 2014, Jael left her child with a roommate. This was normal. She wasn't leaving the kid alone or in danger. She was going out, maybe to meet someone, maybe to grab dinner, maybe just to get some air. She took her white Ford Expedition, a beast of an SUV that's hard to miss, and drove into the Anchorage night. And that's where the story starts to fall apart. Now, this is where the timeline gets messy, and the mess is what makes this case so frustrating. October 11th, 2014, evening. Jael is last seen at her residence in the Trailside Loop area. She's dressed in her dark coat, scarf, jeans, and high heels. She leaves her child with the roommate and heads out. She's driving her expedition. The exact time isn't clear, but it's late, probably after 9 or 10 p.m. Here's what we don't know. Who was she meeting? Where was she going? Did she tell the roommate her plans? These basic questions, questions that should have immediate answers in any missing persons case, remain murky. Either the roommate didn't ask, or Jael didn't say, or the information has been kept close by investigators. October 12, 2014. According to the NAMIS database, this is listed as the date of last contact. That suggests Jael's phone was still active on the 12th, maybe a text message, maybe a call, maybe just a ping to a cell tower. But there's no public information about who she contacted or what was said. This is a critical gap. If her phone was active on the 12th, but she disappeared on the 11th, it raises the possibility that someone else had her phone. October 13th, 2014, Jael is officially reported missing. That's roughly 36 to 48 hours after she was last seen. In missing persons cases, the first 48 hours are crucial. Memories are fresh. Evidence is still intact. The longer you wait, the colder the trail gets. The delay here is significant. Why did it take 2 days for someone to report her missing? Did the roommate assume she was staying with a friend? Did they try calling her first and get no answer? At some point during the investigation, Jael's white Ford Expedition is found. It's abandoned in a parking lot on the outskirts of Anchorage. The keys are missing. Her purse is gone, but the car itself is intact. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle. It's just sitting there, like she parked it and walked away. Now, here's the detail that haunts me. The car was found in a location that doesn't match where her phone last pinged. Cell phone records showed activity, either data usage or tower pings, in areas that were miles from where the expedition was discovered. This suggests one of two things. Either Jael left the car and traveled or was taken to another location, or someone else had her phone and was moving it around. Okay, so whenever a young person goes missing, there's always a faction of people who jump to the "they ran away" theory. And I get it. Sometimes people do run away. They're overwhelmed, they're struggling, they want to start over. But let's apply some logic here and see if that theory holds up for Jael. Problem 1. The child Jael had a young child. Statistically, mothers who voluntarily disappear make some provision for their kids. They call a relative, they leave a note, they make sure the child is going to be okay. Jael left her kid with a roommate, yes, but the implication is that it was temporary. A few hours, maybe overnight. She didn't pack the kids' things and drop them off with grandma. She didn't say, "I'm leaving for good. Take care of my baby." When a mother walks away from her child completely, no contact, no explanation, no financial support, it's almost always because of one of two things: severe mental health crisis, psychotic break, suicidal ideation, or coercion, abduction. There's no evidence that Jael was suicidal. And the psychotic break theory doesn't fit either. She was functioning. She was going out. She was dressed up. She drove a car. You don't do those things if you're in the middle of a mental health collapse. Problem 2, the weather and the clothing. It's October in Alaska. The temperature at night is in the 30s, maybe low 40s. There's snow on the ground. And Jael is wearing high heels. Let me repeat that. High heels. You cannot walk long distances in high heels. You cannot hike. You cannot run effectively. High heels are urban footwear. They tether you to pavement, to cars, to buildings. If Jael's car broke down or ran out of gas, the rational thing to do is stay with the vehicle. Cars provide shelter. They hold heat, at least for a while. You don't abandon your car in freezing weather and start walking unless you have a very good reason, like someone is chasing you or someone convinces you to leave with them. But if Jael left the car voluntarily, where did she go? The parking lot where the expedition was found is on the outskirts of town, near the edge of the wilderness. There are no nearby houses, no convenience stores, no places to walk to. If she started walking, she'd either head back toward the city, miles away, or into the woods. And if she went into the woods in high heels, in the dark, in October, she wouldn't survive the night. Problem 3. The phone pings. This is the detail that changes everything. Jael's phone was active after the car was found. It pinged cell towers in locations that didn't match where the expedition was parked. This tells us the phone was moving. Now, there are two possibilities. 1. Jael left the car and traveled, voluntarily or involuntarily, to another location, taking her phone with her. 2. Someone else had her phone and was moving it around, either to use it or to create a false trail. If Jael left the car on her own, where was she going? And why didn't she call for help? If someone else had her phone, that strongly suggests abduction. The phone becomes a piece of evidence, a digital breadcrumb trail. But it only works if investigators can access the records and follow the pings. And if they did, they haven't shared that information publicly. Problem 4. The predator factor. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Alaska Triangle isn't just about mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. It's also about how easy it is to make someone disappear in a place this vast and empty. Anchorage has a dark side. It has one of the highest rates of violent crime and sexual assault in the country. There are predators here, human predators, who understand that the wilderness is the perfect place to hide a body. Jael's case has all the hallmarks of a predatory abduction. She was young, alone, and vulnerable. She was driving at night in a city where certain areas are isolated and poorly lit. If someone approached her, at a gas station, in a parking lot, at a bar, and convinced her to get out of her car, or if someone forced her out, the vast Alaskan wilderness becomes the perfect disposal site. The lack of a struggle at the car is actually consistent with this theory. Predators don't always use brute force, they use manipulation. They use weapons. A gun or a knife in the right hands can control someone without leaving a mark on the vehicle. Jael gets out of her expedition, willingly or at gunpoint, and gets into another vehicle. The expedition is left behind. The predator takes Jael and her purse and her keys and drives away. And then the wilderness does what it does best. It hides the evidence. So what happened to Jael Hamblin? The most likely explanation is that she was abducted. Someone, either a stranger or someone she knew, lured her out of her car or forced her out. That person took her to a secondary location where she was killed. Her body was then disposed of in the Alaskan wilderness, in a place so remote that 10 years of searching hasn't uncovered it. The alternative, that Jael voluntarily walked away from her life, her child, and her family, doesn't fit the evidence. It doesn't fit the weather. It doesn't fit the timeline, and it doesn't fit the profile of a young mother fighting to build a life. What makes this case so frustrating is the silence. Someone knows what happened. If Jael met someone that night, that person knows. If she was seen at a bar or a gas station or a parking lot, someone saw. But no credible witness has ever come forward. No confession, no tip that led to a body. Jael's family has spent the last 10 years in limbo. Her child is growing up with questions instead of answers, and somewhere in Anchorage, or in the mountains beyond it, Jael Hamblin is still out there, waiting to be found. The snow melts every spring. Hikers wander into the foothills. Hunters explore remote valleys. But year after year, the wilderness keeps its secrets. Jael Tiara Hamblin was 20 years old. She had pink hair, green eyes, and a child who needed her. She drove into the October night in a white Ford Expedition and never came home. And the Alaska Triangle, whether you believe it's a supernatural phenomenon or just the perfect hunting ground for human monsters, claimed another life. Because here's the truth about the Alaska Triangle. The most dangerous thing in the woods isn't a bear or a Bigfoot or a dimensional portal. It's another person. And in a place this big, this empty, this indifferent, it's terrifyingly easy to get away with murder. Jael Hamblin deserved better. Her family deserves answers. And somewhere out there, the person who knows what happened is still walking free. September 9th, 2013, Yakutat, Alaska. It's mid-afternoon, and the weather along the coast is what you'd call marginal. Low clouds, mist, the kind of conditions that make flying tricky but not impossible. At the Yakutat airport, a 47-year-old pilot named Alan Foster is preparing for takeoff. He's flying a Piper PA-32-360, a single-engine Cherokee 6. It's a solid plane, a workhorse. Alan has just landed here to refuel. He's on the final leg of a long cross-country ferry flight. He bought this plane in Atlanta, Georgia, and he's been flying it across the entire continent, thousands of miles, heading home to Anchorage. He's only 360 miles from home. A couple of hours and he'll be there. Alan Foster isn't some weekend pilot. He's got over 9,000 flight hours in his logbook. To put that in perspective, a commercial airline pilot needs 1,500 hours to get hired. Alan has spent more than a year of his life in the air. He knows Alaska. He knows this route. He's flown it dozens of times. He's cautious, experienced, and professional. He files his flight plan. He checks the weather. He radios Juneau Flight Service and tells them his plan B. If conditions get worse, he'll divert to Cordova. He's not pushing his luck. He's being smart. At 3:29 p.m., Alan takes off from Yakutat. His plane climbs into the cloudy sky, heading northwest along the coast toward Anchorage. At 3:47 p.m., radar picks him up about 45 miles west of Yakutat, flying at 1 to 100 feet. Everything looks normal. And then, at 3:47 and 30 seconds, the radar blip just stops. Not a descent, not erratic movement, not a spiraling plunge. The radar contact simply ceases to exist. It's as if someone reached into the sky and flipped a switch, turning Alan Foster and his plane off like a light. Immediately, search and rescue is mobilized. The Coast Guard, the Civil Air Patrol, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, they launch a massive operation. They cover over 325,000 square miles. They fly for days, then weeks. And here's where it gets spooky. Searchers start picking up emergency signals, faint intermittent beeps on the emergency frequency. They fly toward the signal. It gets stronger. They think they're closing in. And then, suddenly, the signal stops. They turn around. The signal starts again, but now it's coming from a different location, miles away. Pilots describe it as being ghosted. It's as if the signal is leading them on a chase, guiding them to empty valleys and barren ridges, only to vanish when they get close. After weeks of searching, they find nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no debris, no body. Alan Foster and his Piper PA-32, an entire airplane with a wingspan of over 30 feet, simply vanish into the Alaskan wilderness. And that phantom emergency signal, it still haunts the pilots who heard it, because emergency beacons are dumb machines. They don't move, they don't turn off and on, they don't play games. But this one did. Let me give you some context, because understanding the route and the environment is critical here. The flight from Yakutat to Anchorage follows the coastline of the Gulf of Alaska. It's a stunning route, snow-capped mountains to your right, the dark freezing ocean to your left. But it's also one of the most dangerous flight paths in North America. The terrain is hostile, the weather is unpredictable, and if you go down, you're going down in a place where search and rescue is measured in days, not hours. The Malaspina Glacier dominates this section of coastline. It's a massive Piedmont glacier, bigger than the state of Rhode Island, spilling out from the St. Elias Mountains almost to the ocean. The mountains themselves rise to over 18,000 feet. The safe corridor for small planes is a narrow strip between the peaks and the water, and in September, that corridor is often choked with clouds, mist, and rapidly changing weather. Alan Foster's plane, the Piper PA-32-360, tail number N9313Z, was built in 1952. Now, that might sound ancient, but these planes are tanks. They're simple, reliable, and easy to maintain. A well-kept PA-32 from the 1950s can be safer than a brand new plane that's been neglected. Alan had just ferried this plane 4,000 miles across North America. If there was a major mechanical issue, it would have shown up long before he reached Alaska. Alan himself was as experienced as they come. 47 years old, 9,000 flight hours. He'd worked as a commercial pilot for years. He knew the Alaska routes intimately. He understood mountain flying, coastal weather, and the risks of single-engine operations. He wasn't a cowboy. He wasn't cutting corners. He was doing everything right. On the afternoon of September 9th, he landed in Yakutat to refuel. He went inside and got a weather briefing in person. The forecast wasn't great. Clouds, mist, possible icing, but it wasn't catastrophic either. Yakutat itself was visual flight rules, meaning the weather was good enough to fly by sight. The route ahead was listed as marginal to instrument flight rules, meaning the clouds were lower and visibility was reduced but still manageable for an experienced pilot. Alan made the smart call. He told Juneau Flight Service, "If conditions deteriorate, I'll divert to Cordova." He had a backup plan. He wasn't going to force it. At 3:29 p.m., he took off. Everything was routine. Let's walk through the final 18 minutes of Alan Foster's flight, because this is where things go from routine to impossible. 3:29 p.m. Alan departs Yakutat Airport. He climbs out, heading northwest along the coast. The plan is to follow the shoreline, staying visual with the ground. This is standard procedure for single-engine flights in Alaska. You don't fly over open water if you can avoid it. You hug the coast so that if the engine quits, you have options. A beach, a gravel bar, maybe even a road. 3:47 p.m. Radar picks up Alan's plane about 45 miles west of Yakutat. He's flying at 100 feet. That's low, really low. It tells us he's scud running, flying under a layer of clouds to maintain visual contact with the terrain. This is legal, but it's risky. Your margin for error is slim. If the clouds drop suddenly, or if you misjudge your altitude, you can fly straight into a mountain or the water before you realize it. Alan radios Juneau Flight Service. He reports that he's found a hole, a gap in the clouds, and he's descending through it near Big River. This is the last communication anyone ever hears from him. 3:47:30 p.m. The radar contact vanishes. Not a gradual descent, not a loss of altitude. The blip on the radar screen just stops. 1 second it's there, the next second it's not. No distress call, no mayday, no emergency transponder signal. Alan Foster and his plane simply cease to exist on radar. Within minutes, the alarm is raised. In Alaska, when a plane goes off radar without explanation, you don't wait. Search and rescue is mobilized immediately. The Coast Guard launches helicopters. The Civil Air Patrol deploys fixed-wing aircraft. Volunteers join the search. They start scanning the coastline, the mountains, the glaciers. Over the next several days, the search operation grows. At its peak, there are dozens of aircraft in the air, flying grid patterns, searching every valley, every ridge, every beach. They cover 325,000 square miles, an area larger than Texas. C-130 cargo planes fly high-altitude sweeps. Helicopters fly low and slow, scanning for wreckage. And then, the signals start. Now, this is where it gets spooky. And this is the detail that pilots who worked this search still can't explain. Emergency locator transmitters are required on all aircraft. When a plane crashes, the G-forces trigger the ELT and it starts broadcasting a distress signal on 121.5 MHz, the international emergency frequency. The signal is picked up by satellites and by any aircraft in the area. It's a lifesaver. It's how searchers find downed planes. A few days into the search, pilots start picking up faint intermittent signals on the emergency frequency. The signals are weak, breaking up, hard to pinpoint. But they're there. The search teams get excited. This could be Alan's ELT. This could be the break they need. They fly toward the signal. As they get closer, it gets stronger. They're homing in. They're going to find him. And then the signal stops. They circle the area. Nothing. They expand the search. Still nothing. Frustrated, they move on. And then the signal starts again. But now it's coming from a different location, miles away. On the other side of a mountain range, they fly toward it. The signal gets stronger. They think they're close. And then it stops again. This happens multiple times. Pilots describe it as being led on a wild goose chase. One search pilot said it felt like the signal was intelligent, like it was deliberately leading them away from the actual crash site. Another pilot used the word ghosted. Now, here's the thing about ELTs. They're dumb machines. They sit in the wreckage and beep. That's it. They don't move. They don't turn off when someone gets close. They don't reappear miles away. The only way an ELT signal moves is if the wreckage itself is moving, drifting in water or being carried by animals or something. But the signal searchers were picking up didn't behave like a normal ELT. It behaved like something was broadcasting the signal, moving it around, playing with the search teams. By September 24th, 2 weeks after Alan disappeared, the search is officially suspended. They've flown 325,000 square miles. They've checked every lead. They've found nothing. Okay, so the official explanation is that Alan crashed into the water or hit a glacier and the wreckage is buried somewhere in the vast Alaskan wilderness. But let's pick that apart because there are some serious problems with that theory. Problem 1. The radar disappearance. Radar tracks solid objects. When a plane crashes, it doesn't just vanish. Even if it explodes mid-air, the pieces fall. They show up on radar as they descend. A cloud of debris dropping at different rates. Controllers can see it. It's messy, but it's visible. Alan Foster's plane didn't do that. The radar contact just stopped, instantly, as if the plane ceased to be a physical object. Now, there are a few scenarios where this could happen. 1. The plane dove straight into the water at high speed, and the impact was so violent that it disintegrated instantly. 2. The plane hit a mountain face and was obliterated on impact. 3. The transponder failed at the exact moment the plane crashed, and radar lost the signal. But here's the problem. If the plane hit the water or a mountain at high speed from 1 through 100 feet, there should be a debris field. Wreckage floats, aluminum reflects light, seat cushions, fuel slicks, pieces of wing. Something should have been visible from the air. The search teams were flying low and slow, specifically looking for this kind of evidence. They found nothing. Problem 2. The moving signal. This is the detail that keeps me up at night. ELTs are designed to survive crashes. They're built to withstand G-forces, fire, and water. When they activate, they sit in the wreckage and broadcast a continuous signal. Satellites pick it up, search planes pick it up. You triangulate the signal and find the crash site. But the signal searchers were picking up didn't behave like that. It moved. It turned off and on. It appeared in multiple locations, miles apart. Now, skeptics would say it was atmospheric interference, radio signals bouncing off mountains, creating false echoes. That happens. Or maybe it was a different ELT from a different crash, unrelated to Alan Foster, also possible. But the search pilots didn't think so. They described the signal as consistent with an aircraft ELT, not random noise. And the fact that it appeared to move, to lead them to different locations, suggests something more than simple interference. Some pilots who worked the search have privately suggested that the signal might have been coming from Alan's plane as it drifted. Maybe he crashed into the ocean, and the wreckage floated with the currents, broadcasting intermittently as waves washed over it. That would explain the movement. But it doesn't explain why. After weeks of searching the coastline and the water, they never found a single piece of floating debris. Problem 3. The total absence. A Piper PA-32 is not a small plane. It's got a 32-foot wingspan. It weighs over a ton. It's made of aluminum, steel, glass, fabric. When a plane like that crashes, it leaves evidence: wreckage, burn marks, a debris field. The search for Alan Foster covered 325,000 square miles. They used helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground teams. They searched beaches, glaciers, mountain valleys, and offshore waters. They found nothing. Not a piece of aluminum, not a seat cushion, not a fuel slick, not a trace. It's a clean erase. And that's what elevates this case into Alaska Triangle territory. Because planes don't just vanish. Even in the vastness of Alaska, even in the most remote wilderness, wreckage eventually turns up. Hikers find it, hunters find it, glaciers release it, the ocean washes it ashore. But from Alan Foster's Piper PA-32, nothing, ever. So what happened to Alan Foster? The most likely explanation is still the official one. He was flying low, trying to stay under the clouds. The weather deteriorated. He encountered a snow squall or a patch of fog. In flat light conditions, where the white sky blends with the white glacier or the glassy water, he lost visual reference. He didn't realize he was descending, and he flew straight into the Malaspina Glacier or the Gulf of Alaska. The impact was catastrophic. The wreckage sank into deep water or was buried under snow within hours. The ELT failed to activate, or the signal was blocked by water or ice. And the phantom signals the search teams heard, atmospheric interference, false echoes, coincidence, that's the rational explanation. And maybe it's true. But it doesn't explain the feeling the search pilots had. The sense that they were being toyed with, the way the signal seemed to move intelligently, leading them on, always staying just out of reach. One pilot described it as being ghosted by the mountain. Another said it felt like the wilderness was protecting the crash site, hiding it, refusing to give it up. Alan Foster was only a couple of hours from home. He'd flown 4,000 miles across an entire continent. He was almost there. And then, 45 miles west of Yakutat, he flew into the Alaska Triangle. And the triangle not only took him, it erased every trace of his existence. To this day, Alan Foster is known as the Ghost Pilot. Not because he haunts the skies, but because his disappearance defies every logical explanation. The radar showed him flying, and then it showed him ceasing to exist. The emergency signal suggested he was out there, calling for help. But every time searchers got close, the signal vanished, as if the wilderness itself was playing a cruel game. Alan Foster flew into the clouds on September 9th, 2013. And somewhere in the vast frozen wilderness of Alaska, he's still there, waiting to be found. or perhaps waiting to lead one more search team on one more ghost chase into the empty mountains. July 7th, 2012. Granite Creek Campground, Alaska. It's a warm summer evening, the kind of night when the Alaskan sun lingers until almost midnight, casting everything in that golden dreamlike light. The campground is busy. Families roasting marshmallows, kids running between tents, the sound of laughter and music drifting through the trees. This isn't the deep wilderness. Granite Creek is just off the Seward Highway, about an hour south of Anchorage. It's accessible, it's popular. It's the kind of place where people feel safe. At one of the campsites, a 43-year-old woman named Valerie Sifsoff is having a rough night. She's here with her boyfriend, Elliot Freeberg. They've been camping, drinking, trying to enjoy a summer weekend together. But things aren't going well. They've been arguing, nothing violent, just the kind of tension that builds up between couples. Valerie is frustrated. She needs space. She needs air. Around midnight, after another argument, Valerie does what a lot of people do when they need to cool off. She walks away. She heads out of the campsite, maybe toward the restrooms, maybe toward the road, maybe just to clear her head. She's wearing a black hoodie, sweatpants, and rain boots. She doesn't take her phone. She doesn't take her purse. She's just stepping away for a few minutes. And she never comes back. Elliot waits. He assumes she's cooling down, that she'll circle back when she's ready. But the minutes turn into hours. The sun finally sets. The campground quiets down, and Valerie is still gone. By morning, it's clear something's wrong. Elliot searches the area. He checks the restrooms, the trails, the parking lot. Nothing. He finally calls the Alaska State Troopers. Search and rescue is mobilized. Dogs are brought in. Helicopters sweep the area. Volunteers comb the woods and the riverbanks. They find nothing. No footprints leading into the forest. No sign of a struggle. No body in the creek. Valerie Sifsoff walked into the darkness at Granite Creek Campground, surrounded by other campers just yards from safety, and she simply vanished. More than a decade later, her family is still searching for answers. Because here's the thing, you don't just disappear from a busy campground without someone hearing something. A scream, a splash, a car door slamming. But that night, there was only silence. And silence, in a place like Alaska, can be the most terrifying sound of all. Let me paint the picture for you, because the setting is critical to understanding how impossible this disappearance is. Granite Creek Campground sits at mile 64 of the Seward Highway, one of the most scenic and most traveled roads in Alaska. This isn't some remote backcountry site accessible only by bush plane. You can drive here from Anchorage in about an hour. It's a developed campground with designated sites, picnic tables, fire rings, and vault toilets. In the summer, it's packed with tourists, families, and locals enjoying the outdoors. The campground is bordered by two major geographic features, the Seward Highway to the west and Granite Creek, a tributary of 6 Mile Creek to the east. 6 Mile Creek is famous for whitewater rafting. The water's fast, cold, and dangerous, fed by glacial melt. It's not the kind of creek you casually wade into. But it's also not everywhere. It's a defined waterway. You'd have to actively walk toward it to end up in it. On July 7th, 2012, the campground was busy. It was the height of summer. The weather was mild. Other campers were nearby. Families, couples, groups of friends. This wasn't isolation. This was a public space full of people. Valerie Sifsoff was 43 years old. She was Yupik and Inupiaq, part of a prominent Alaskan native family. Her niece is Kala Chaithluk Sifsoff, an Olympic snowboarder. Valerie was described as calm, reserved, and capable. She wasn't some naive tourist unfamiliar with Alaska. She understood the land. She understood the risks. She was camping with her boyfriend, Elliot Freeberg, who was 32 at the time, about 11 years younger than Valerie. By all accounts, their relationship was rocky. They'd been drinking that day, beer and whiskey, and they'd been arguing on and off. The arguments weren't violent or physical, just the kind of bickering that happens when two people are cooped up together and the alcohol amplifies every small irritation. Around midnight, after another argument, Valerie had had enough. She walked away from the campsite. And that's where the story ends, or rather, where it stops making sense. Let's walk through the night of July 7th and the morning of July 8th because the details matter, and so do the gaps. July 7th, 2012, evening. Valerie and Elliot arrive at Granite Creek Campground. They set up their tent, crack open some beers, and settle in. Other campers are around them. It's a normal summer evening. Valerie and Elliot drink and argue. Reports suggest the arguments were intermittent. They'd fight, cool off, drink some more, fight again. Nothing that drew the attention of other campers. Nothing violent, just tension. Around midnight, final argument happened. Valerie, frustrated, decides to walk away. According to Elliot, this wasn't unusual behavior for her. She'd done it before, walked off to cool down, then come back once she'd cleared her head. It was her way of de-escalating conflict. Valerie leaves the campsite. She's wearing a black DKNY hoodie, blue sweatpants, and black rain boots. She doesn't take her phone. She doesn't take her purse or ID. She's not planning to go far. She's just stepping away. Elliot waits. He assumes she'll be back in like 10, 20, maybe 30 minutes. 2:00 a.m. Elliot starts to get concerned. It's been 2 hours. He does a cursory search around the campsite. He checks the vault toilets, the nearby trails. He calls her name. No response. 4 a.m. Elliot falls asleep. This detail is important, and it's one that investigators would later scrutinize. Some people found it suspicious that he went to sleep instead of continuing to search or calling for help. Others argued that it made sense. He was drunk, exhausted, and assuming she'd stumbled off to another campsite or was sleeping it off somewhere. Morning, July 8th. Elliot wakes up. Valerie still isn't back. He searches again. Still nothing. He waits. Hours pass. And here's where the timeline gets truly bizarre. Elliot doesn't report her missing immediately. He packs up the campsite and drives back to Anchorage. He later claims he thought she'd hitched a ride home or gone to a friend's house. He says he returned to the campground over the next couple of days to look for her. July 11th, 2012. 4 days later. Elliot finally reports Valerie missing to the Alaska State Troopers. This 4-day delay is a massive problem for the investigation. By the time search and rescue mobilizes, it's been 96 hours since Valerie was last seen. Any scent trail for the dogs is long gone. Any footprints have been washed away by rain or obscured by other campers. The crime scene, if there was one, has been contaminated or erased. Despite the delay, a major search operation is launched. Dogs, helicopters, ground teams, and volunteers scour the area. They focus on 3 possibilities. 1. Valerie fell into Granite Creek or 6 Mile Creek and drowned. 2. Valerie got lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure or injury. 3. Valerie was abducted or harmed by another person. Weeks into the search, they find something. Valerie's black DKNY hoodie. It's recovered from the creek, either Granite Creek or the 6 Mile drainage. The hoodie is torn, wet, and tangled in debris. But there's no sign of Valerie herself. Now, this is the part that scares campers. Because Granite Creek Campground isn't some isolated backcountry site. It's a public campground, surrounded by people, bordered by a highway and a river. And yet, Valerie Sifsoff managed to vanish without a single witness, without a scream, without a trace, until her hoodie turned up in the water weeks later. Let's analyze the theories, because none of them hold up cleanly. Theory 1. She drowned in the creek. This is the leading theory, and on the surface, it makes sense. Valerie walked toward the creek, either intentionally or by accident, slipped on the muddy bank, fell into the freezing, fast-moving water, and drowned. The current carried her downstream. Her hoodie got snagged on a branch, but her body continued into 6 Mile Creek and eventually into the Turnagain Arm, where the massive tides dispersed her remains into the ocean. The evidence supporting this theory. 1. Her hoodie was found in the creek. 2. 6 Mile Creek is deadly. The water is glacial melt, around 38 degrees. If you fall in, the cold shock response can cause you to inhale water instantly. The current is powerful enough to pin a body underwater or trap it in submerged debris. 3. Valerie was wearing rain boots, which are death traps in fast water. They fill instantly, dragging your feet down and making it impossible to swim. But here's the problem. If Valerie drowned in the creek on July 7th, why didn't searchers find her body? Bodies in cold water often don't decompose quickly. They can be trapped underwater for weeks or months. The search teams used dogs, sonar, and divers. They checked the likely downstream areas. If she drowned close to the campground, her body should have been found, or at least more of her clothing should have washed up. And there's another issue: the geography. To get from the campsite to the creek, you have to walk through the woods over uneven terrain in the dark. Valerie wasn't suicidal. She wasn't trying to reach the creek. She was walking away to cool off. Why would she walk toward dangerous water instead of toward the road or the restrooms? Theory 2. She got lost in the woods. Some have suggested that Valerie, disoriented by alcohol and anger, wandered into the woods and got lost. She suffered from exposure, fell and injured herself, or simply couldn't find her way back. But here's the problem with that theory: the terrain. Granite Creek Campground is bordered by the Seward Highway on one side and the creek on the other. It's a narrow corridor. If you walk in any direction for more than a few hundred yards, you're going to hit one of those two barriers. The highway has traffic, the creek is loud, you can hear them. How do you get so lost that you can't walk toward a sound? And remember, it was summer. The nights are short. Valerie only had to survive a few hours until dawn, when she could have oriented herself and walked back. Search teams combed every inch of the woods around the campground. If she'd collapsed from injury or exposure, they would have found her. Theory 3. Foul play. The boyfriend, Elliot Freeberg's behavior raises red flags. The 4-day delay in reporting her missing is bizarre. His explanation, that he thought she hitched a ride home, doesn't hold up. Why would a 43-year-old woman without her phone, purse, or ID hitchhike 60 miles home in the middle of the night? Some have speculated that the argument turned physical. Maybe Elliot hurt Valerie, panicked, and disposed of her body. The delay in reporting could have been to give himself time to clean up the evidence or establish an alibi. But here's the problem. There's no evidence of violence, no blood at the campsite, no witnesses reporting screaming or a struggle, and Elliot cooperated with investigators. He participated in searches. He passed a polygraph. If he killed her, where's the body? How did he dispose of it so thoroughly that a massive search operation found nothing? Theory 4. Abduction by a stranger. This is the darkest theory, and it's the one that keeps people up at night. What if someone else was at the campground that night? What if Valerie walked toward the road and a predator, someone driving the Seward Highway, saw her, stopped, and grabbed her? The Seward Highway is lonely at night. There are stretches where you can drive for miles without seeing another car. If someone forced Valerie into a vehicle, they could have driven her anywhere. Into the mountains, to a remote cabin, to a secondary location where she was killed and buried. The problem with this theory is the lack of evidence. No witnesses saw a suspicious vehicle. No one heard a struggle. Valerie's hoodie being found in the creek suggests she ended up in the water, not in a car. But the hoodie could have been planted, or Valerie could have been attacked near the creek and her body moved afterward. So what happened to Valerie Sifsoff? The most likely explanation is still the drowning theory. Valerie, intoxicated and upset, walked toward the creek, to cool off by the water, to wash her face, or simply because she was disoriented in the dark. She slipped on the muddy bank, fell into the freezing, fast-moving water, and drowned. The cold shock response incapacitated her instantly. Her rain boots filled with water, dragging her down. Her body was swept downstream into 6 Mile Creek and eventually into the Turnagain Arm, where the tide scattered her remains. Her hoodie got snagged on a branch, marking the spot where she entered the water. But her body continued on, lost to the sea. That's the rational explanation. And it might be true, but it doesn't explain the 4-day delay in reporting her missing. It doesn't explain why no one heard a splash or a scream, and it doesn't explain how, in a campground full of people, she could vanish without a single witness. What haunts me most about this case is the proximity. Valerie wasn't in the deep wilderness. She wasn't on a solo expedition into the backcountry. She was at a public campground, surrounded by families, just yards from her tent. She walked into the dark for a moment of peace, to clear her head, to breathe, to escape an argument, and the dark never gave her back. Her family has kept her name alive for over a decade. They've organized searches, they've posted flyers, they've never stopped looking. Valerie's niece, the Olympic snowboarder, has used her platform to keep the case in the public eye. But so far, nothing. No new leads, no body. Just a hoodie in a creek and a decade of unanswered questions. Valerie Sifsoff walked away from a campfire on a warm July night, and somewhere between the glow of the fire and the darkness of the woods, she disappeared. Whether she drowned, got lost, was harmed by someone she knew, or was taken by a stranger, we may never know. But one thing is certain, the Alaska Triangle doesn't just swallow people in the remote wilderness. Sometimes it reaches out and takes them from crowded campgrounds, from busy highways, from places where they should have been safe. Valerie Sifsoff deserved better. Her family deserves answers, and somewhere in the cold waters of 6 Mile Creek, or buried in the mountains, or lost to the sea, the truth is still waiting to be found.